The young lady sat next to her mother, who was suffering from a fever. She looked at her mother with tears in her eyes and did not understand how everything turned out this way. She wondered why everything was happening like this, since her father had died, and now her mother. The young lady knew she couldn't lose her mother too. Pulling herself together, she turned around and looked at her mother. She asked her to wait a little. The butler looked at the Duke and said that he had. The Duke looked at the girl in surprise and said that if a candidate for the position of maid had come, the butler told the Duke something that was not what he thought. The young lady looked at the Duke and said that she did not need a job. She came closer to the Duke and took something out of her pocket. A moment later, the Duke looked at the young lady in surprise, for he was very surprised. The Duke saw a pendant that was impossible not to recognize, because it was the thing of her late father. The Duke asked the girl what her mother's name was. She looked at him and said that her mother's name was Renata, and that the Duke sighed heavily and said that everything was true, and it seemed that it really was incredible. The Duke looked at the butler and told him to leave them alone. The butler in turn bowed and he asked the girl how her mother was coping after her father's death. She said that her mother was living a poor and unhappy life. She said that this is how most women live who have to raise a child alone. She knew that people usually sympathize when she talks, but perhaps the members of this family, on the contrary, will rejoice and mock her, since there were rumors that they hated her mother because she was from a lower, and yet she understood that she could only ask them for help, since she had to do everything possible to cure her mother. The young lady said that her mother was now seriously ill, and perhaps they did not care, but she begged them to save her mother. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she thought that he would really help her when she came. He looked at her and said that because his older brother ran away from home because of some love, their family lost an heir, and the Duke said that their family had no reason to help them. The young lady tolerated him, listened to him. She said that she was the only daughter of his older brother, and if they helped and saved her mother, then she would move to the mansion. She said that she would stop communicating with all the people she knew. Before the Duke asked if she understood what, he glared at her and said that her mother was also included in that. He asked her if she realized that she would never be able to see her again in this life. She looked at him intently. A moment later, she said with complete confidence that she was ready for this. The Duke stood dumbfounded on the spot. He looked at her and asked what her name was. She looked at the Duke and said that her name was Sabina. The Duke asked how old she was. Sabina said that she was currently 8 years old. Turning around, the Duke said that from now on her name would be Sabina Roel. He looked at her and said that he would save her mother, so she should not forget how important the family name she would bear was. The man looking out the window asked if Liam's daughter had come to see. The butler asked his forgiveness and said that he should have brought her to him first, but he was very worried about his. The man said angrily that it didn't matter because he had no desire to meet the daughter of the bastard who stabbed his parents. The young man angrily told his father that he had always thought he was right, but now he was. The man shouted at his son that he was a fool because he had crossed the line and fallen in love with a press servant and disgrace. He told his son that in the end he would soon crawl back and beg him for forgiveness. He sighed heavily and said that 13 years had already passed. 3 years had passed since the young lady came to the estate. Melissa entered the room and asked if they had finished. Melissa said that the atmosphere in the dining room was so oppressive that she decided to leave because Mr. Simon was very harsh with the young. The other maid said that she understood why the master disliked her so much because the young mistress was a half. The great Charlotte family are great water mages, and their abilities are passed down through generations. So in Charlotte's family, it seemed like everyone had to be a genius in this area. The current head of the family and the Duchess's father, Mr. Liam, was talented, so everyone expected that their mistress would have the same outstanding. Usually the gift manifests itself at the age of 10, but unfortunately, nothing like that manifested itself in her. For this reason, everyone began to say that her gift did not manifest due to the admixture of dirty blood. The young lady was sitting and eating when suddenly her grandfather called her, and he looked at her and said that he had spent a lot of money on her clothes, but she continued to wear the same outfit. Mr. Simon asked if she really wanted rumors to spread that the Duchess only had one. Sabina looked away and said that she would be more careful in future. She was angry with her grandfather because he criticized, and yet this had become a habit for her, and she wondered who would treat with warmth an illegitimate child, a half-breed that her late son had left behind. Benjamin said that the prince would be arriving soon, and he was going to give him a room at the end of the corridor on the second floor. Mr. Simon said that since the Empress herself had done them the great honor of entrusting their house with the education of her son, they should give him an The master told his granddaughter that they must temporarily move her to an outbuilding, and when the prince arrived, she would not be allowed to appear, and she must not be seen by anyone. If she does run into the prince, she must be introduced to the maid. She wondered if he was ashamed to show his half-blood granddaughter to a noble. Sabina said that she understood everything, but still she felt unbearably hurt by her grandfather's words, even though she knew that he would condemn her. The gentleman said that he hoped that she would not cause inconvenience to the prince by her. The lady was shocked by her grandfather's statement, and with a trembling voice, she asked for forgiveness. She was shocked as she wondered if she had misheard, and if the fifth Prince Ricardo was coming. The young lady asked for forgiveness and said that she was not feeling well and had indigestion. She asked if she could go to her. Mr. Simon looked at his granddaughter in surprise and said that Sabina thanked him for his generosity. She remembered that the prince's name was Ricardo, just like in the novel her friend had written, and that was the name of the psychopathic prince. Sabina froze in place as she heard someone calling. At first, it seemed to her that she had simply been reborn. But when she was walking down the street next to her mother, she heard rumors about the fifth prince. People were talking about the prince, and it seemed to her as if they were describing some character from a book. It seemed to her that she had heard about it somewhere, but she still understood that this could not be true, and she could not be reborn as the heroine of the novel. That's what she always thought. She knew that she was an illegitimate child of half-breed. Her relatives treated her with disdain. Now she heard about the fifth prince, who was going to stay in the manor for a while. She was shocked because she realized that this was all similar to what was happening. The main character of the novel, Ricardo, spent his childhood in persecution, and as soon as he reached adulthood, he was sent against his will to the battlefield. After this, he meets the pious protagonist and finds his salvation. Eventually, Ricardo slew the greatest of the demons and ascended to the imperial. Having received everyone's blessings, he and his beloved meet a happy end. The friends were sitting and discussing the novel, and one of them said that it was a very boring novel, and the main character had to. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise and asked who Sabina was and why she was more important than the protagonist. The girl said that it was because of her death that Ricardo suffered serious psychological. They wanted to make him an emotionless psychopath who killed his own weak. Sabina was shocked. She wanted the young ladies to stop and not do. Sabina glanced sideways at the author and wondered what she was doing. Sabina was shocked as the young lady had mercilessly broken the hero's fate, turning him into a psycho. In her sleep, she screamed for them to stop, but she didn't notice how she woke. She was shocked because she realized that she had the same dream again. The young lady thought about it because she knew the prince's name for sure, and now she was convinced that she was inside her friend's novel. On her instructions, her friend rewrote the novel. Her work became terribly dark, and the main character completely lost his She understood that she was in Sabina's body, and her destiny was to die at the hands of a cruel prince. She was very happy at the time for her friend when she made the corrections, and her book became a best. She was a little puzzled by everything that was happening and wondered why she was reborn in this particular novel. She thought that she didn't have magic because it wasn't real. She understood that the prince was already on his way here, and she was powerless to change anything. Sabina wondered if she could influence the story, as she didn't want everything to go as it did. She wondered what she should do, and how she could avoid meeting the prince, since she did not want to die. A moment later, she heard someone calling her, and was very surprised. The young lady looked at the girl in surprise, and asked why she was not in the classroom. Yet Sabina turned around and saw the governess. Sabina looked at her in surprise and said that if the evening classes had been moved to the first half of the day, she would have been. She glanced at her watch and noticed that it was only 7 o'clock in the morning, which she knew was too early even for a morning. Sabina understood that even if she tried to justify herself, Sabina walked slowly to the table, as she understood that she would still need to conduct classes. The governess said with a grin that she would simply conduct the lesson as Mr. Simon. Sabina knew that Madame Clarissa was teaching her on the orders of her Madame Clarissa said that today they would study tea etiquette. Monsieur Simon was so obsessed with the idea of making Sabina the perfect lady that now Madame's words are law for her. Sabina knew that Madame Clarissa had managed to make her catch up with the curriculum in just 3 years, but she didn't think it was because of her outstanding ability. Madame Clarissa looked at the young lady and said in a drab voice that she should pour some. Sabina knew that she had no abilities. It was just that Madame was waiting for the moment when she would make a mistake in order to punish her. Madame Clarissa looked at the young lady with fury and told her to pour more. Sabina looked at her in surprise, wondering if she really needed to pour more tea into such a small cup. Madame asked her angrily why she had frozen, and also shouted at her to pour. A moment later, the young lady filled her cup of tea to the madam told the young lady to take the cup in her hand. She made her fill a completely unsuitable cup to the brim. It seems she will do everything possible to see Sabina's mistake. Sabina's hand was shaking because the cup was very heavy, and she felt like the tea was about. Madame angrily shouted at her that she had raised her finger too high, and at the same time, she angrily struck her on. The maid was shocked by such behavior. I ran closer to the young lady and asked if she was okay, as she had spilled hot tea on. The maid told Sabina to at least take a damp towel from. Madame told Sabina, with a grin, that if she had followed her instructions, everything would have been. But the young lady did not tolerate such treatment and put the cup back down with a bang. The madam looked at the young lady with surprise and anger. Sabina, in turn, looked at the teacher with anger. Madame Clarissa looked at her in surprise and asked what kind of insolent look she was. Sabina looked intently at Madame, who in turn was shocked by Sabina's behavior. Sabina told Madame that she shouldn't talk to her. The madam looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if Sabina really had the nerve to be rude to her. Madam said that if she had inherited everything that could be given to a person, the blood of the Charlotte family, then this could have been avoided. The young lady looked at Madame intently without answer. Sabina understood that Madam didn't even have the thought to apologize, only contempt in her eye. During class, Madame told the young lady that if she dropped a book even once, she would not get. She also told the young lady that their classes would last until dinner. Madame had always made fun of the young lady, but she never expected that she would one day decide to cross the line. Madame Clarissa looked at Sabina intently, but she didn't even think about giving up. Sabina raised her cup. Madame looked at Sabina in surprise and asked what she was doing. A moment later, the cup fell to the ground with a crash, and Madame Clarissa was dumbfounded. Sabina angrily told Madame that she was fired. The madam looked at the young lady with surprise and puzzlement and asked what she. A moment later, Madame asked the young lady what she was doing. Sabina said that she was firing a servant who had knowingly caused harm to her charge. She asked the lady if she had any problem. Madame said it was a simple accident, since she tried to train her properly. And Sabina, the young lady, looked at Madame and told her to call her Duchess from now. Sabina looked at Madame, and now she is not her teacher. The madam looked angrily at the young lady and asked what she was saying. Sabina told Madame that she didn't seem competent enough to teach anyone. Sabina looked at Melissa and told her to escort Madame to the exit. Melissa approached Madame and said that she would escort her to the exit. The madam angrily asked the maid how she dared to treat her like that and used magic on. Sabina was shocked because she couldn't understand how Madame could use magic on an ordinary. Madame, with fury and contempt, said that Sabina was like her mother, just as uneducated and unteachable. Madame said that she still tried to rid her of these insignificant plebeian habits, but apparently in an unavoidable. Sabina was furious because Madame was at it again. and whenever she had the opportunity, she would speak ill of her. Sabina looked at Madame and asked with a smile if she really loved her dad very. Once upon a time, Madame Clarissa was the fiancée of but unfortunately, their wedding was not destined to take place. After all, her fiancé Liam had run away with his lover, so she was sure that Madame was tormenting her only because she was there. And strangely enough, she continued to speak contemptuously of Sabina's mother. Madame Clarissa asked what she was talking about. Sabina said that if their marriage was just a way to strengthen the family's power, and she was only interested in the title, then she could have married the Duke. But this did not happen. She looked especially at Madame and asked again if she really loved her. Madame screamed furiously and said that the beta closed her mouth immediately, as she could no longer. Melissa looked away, scared, and Madame looked at the young lady and asked if she could imagine what would happen if this situation reached Mr. Madame asked if she had forgotten about us, that he personally hired her. Madame said that she was here unlike her mother. Sabina understood that everything was correct and that Mr. Simon's words were but Sabina also knew that Madame had missed something. Sabina looked at Madame with disdain and said that she was the one being kicked out now. Sabina said that she remained, as Mr. Simon would never put her above the blood of the Charlotte. Sabina said that as she thought her father had made a mistake, and she was afraid to imagine how terrible his life would have been if he had. The madam looked at the young lady in bewilderment and told her to Sabina asked her with a grin how much he disliked her, that he decided to run away. Sabina told Madame with contempt that her father had abandoned her. Madame asked if she understood what she was talking. Madame Clarissa swung her arm, as she did not understand how her daughter could dare to speak to a dark woman like. Sabina prepared herself for the blow. She was very scared, but still she understood that the blow was inevitable. But to her surprise, nothing happened. Madame Clarissa froze in place as she saw someone enter. The Duke looked at Madame with fury and called her. He asked her with fury what she was doing. Madame looked at the Duke and said that it was just a misunderstanding. The Duke angrily told Madame Clarissa to leave immediately. Madame, in turn, froze in fear. She did not know what would happen to her after the incident. The Duke looked at Sabina and told her to wait a little, as he had to talk to. Sabina, in turn, was taken aback but still agreed. She did not expect the Duke to be angry. Madame gave the young lady a look of contempt, and Sabina froze, looking after them. She did not expect the Duke to. Melissa came into the lady's room and asked if she was. Sabina realized that Melissa had brought the Duke to her room deliberately. The maid, in turn, was very worried about the young lady and asked her questions, but Sabina was far away. Sabina came to the Duke's office and asked if he had called. The Duke looked at the young lady and told her to explain what had happened that morning. The young lady froze in surprise, as she did not expect him to ask her to explain something. She wondered, looking at the Duke, what Madame had already managed to say to him. Sabina understood that only Madame would ask for forgiveness, and Sabina looked at the Duke and asked if she needed to explain it. The Duke asked her why she had fired Madame, since according to her, Sabina did not want to go to class, and then Sabina looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if he believed. The Duke said that everything depended on her answer, since he could not draw conclusions after hearing only one. The young lady understood that the Duke was right and hoped that he would really listen and heed her words. The young lady lifted up her dress a little, and the Duke looked at her in Sabina said that they had a tea etiquette lesson today. She said that Madame had ordered her to fill the cup to the brim. It was about the same size. Then Madame hit her on the back of her hand with the rod, and she suddenly spilled the tea. She said that now he could see the result with his own eyes. Sabina said that Madame Clarissa was her father's fiancée. She asked the Duke if he was sure that she could not have deliberately harmed her out of hatred for her mother. After listening to her, the Duke said that they would find her a new teacher. He said that the doctor had left. As soon as the doctor returned, he would send her to her. The Duke said that if anything like that happened, she should immediately. The young lady looked at the Duke intently, but she understood that he did not believe her now, and in the future, he would not even listen to her. She knew that it was her grandfather who had turned to Madame, since he had hired her father's ex-fiancée as a teacher for his hate. She wondered if the Duke would listen to her if she complained about Monsieur Simon but she knew better than to get her hopes up. The Duke said that he had a lot of worries now because of the prince's arrival, so the replacement of the teacher would have. He said that after the prince left, they would talk about the teacher. The Duke said that in 3 days there would be. He also said that Fabian would be back soon. Sabina looked at the Duke in surprise. Sabina looked at the broken vase with puzzlement. Fabian said that it was the vase that was given to his father. He looked at her with contempt and said that she had broken a valuable thing. Fabian asked her if she was really getting tangled up in. The young lady was very angry because she realized that he had set her up. Fabian de Charlotte, the eldest son of the head of the house. The young man looked at her with disdain and a smirk. Fabian is young Sabina's cousin, whom he, like all the other members of the family, tried to humiliate her whenever they. Fabian falsely accused the young lady of something she did not do, and he spread rumors in the family, which made them hate her even more. After Fabian entered the academy, she allowed herself to relax, but now she heard about his return. The Duke said that Fabian would take a leave of absence and remain at the mansion while the prince was. The Duke said that because of this, the graduation would be a little delayed, but it would still be impolite of him not. The Duke said that there would be a dinner in 3 days, and that she should also be present. Sabina, looking at the Duke, said that she would behave quietly, so that the lady would not feel awkward. The Duke. A moment later, he said she could go. The young lady bowed. She wondered how she could believe that he actually cared about her. She was furious. The Duke didn't even ask if she was okay. She knew that she shouldn't give in to her feelings, and the main thing for her was to survive the prince's. The maids whispered that Madame Clarissa had been fired because she had harmed the young mistress. Before they pretended not to know about the abuse from Madame. They wondered if they would be thrown out. A moment later, the head maid came and asked the maids why they were there, as she knew they had. The young maids were very scared when they saw the senior maid behind them. The maids said they were afraid that the master would find out about their disdainful attitude towards the head maid said that now they knew everything, so they had to be careful. She said that of course they must be polite and courteous to the lady, as long as the Duke acknowledged her. The maid slowly and carefully treated the young lady's wound. Sabina knew that the madam would no longer conduct classes for her. She knew that there would be no lessons or meetings, but she was still surprised because she didn't think that it would all end so easily. But she still wanted revenge and quietly whispered that they would all pay. Sabina noticed that the maid began to tremble after her words. She noticed that the maid was very scared. Looking at the maid, she wondered if she had said those words out loud. Sabina knew that the maid never made fun of her, but she still stood and simply watched the bullying from the side. Sabina was very surprised by the fact that the maid was not afraid to tell the Duke when things went. Sabina knew that this was saying something. She looked closely at Melissa. A moment later, Sabina told Melissa not to be nervous. Sabina smiled and said that Melissa had done nothing wrong, and she had no reason to be angry. The maid looked at the young mistress in surprise. A moment later, she was on her knees saying she was very. Melissa said she had been afraid the whole time and had talked to Vanessa about. But unfortunately, she always pretended not to notice how the young lady was being. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise as she realized that she had been reporting everything to the head maid. Melissa said she was so sorry, and she didn't know things would turn out this way. She said she would never let anyone hurt her again. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise and asked if she would really be on her. Melissa looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Sabina looked at the maid and asked if she was ready to obey her alone, regardless of the instructions of the Duke or. Melissa froze for a moment, not knowing what to answer. Melissa said she had a brother and Sabina who were the same age as him, and when she was bullied, she felt like they were bullied. Melissa said she swears she will only obey the young mistress. The young lady looked at the maid and asked if she knew which room the prince would be placed in. In the novel, Sabina was only a minor character. She appeared briefly in the memories of others. The order from Monsieur Simon not to appear before the prince was enough to make her feel. The young lady approached the room where the prince would live. She walked inside, slowly looking back so that no one would notice her. She understood that she needed to find out everything that could be seen from the window. She wanted to know what paths and buildings were visible from the window. since she had to hide and not looking out the window, she noticed that the place where she had been moved was not visible from the room. The maids were walking along the corridor, and one of the maids noticed some extraneous noise. The maid looked at her companion in bewilderment and said that she thought she heard a sound coming from entering the room. The maids did not notice anyone. The young lady was hiding in fear. She was shocked because they entered very unexpectedly. She understood that she couldn't catch them. Sitting under the table, she wondered why Sabina hadn't survived if the extension wasn't visible from the prince's. She knew the future, unlike the real Sabina, so she hoped that everything would be okay. She knew that even the empress herself was afraid of the prince, because the prince was a terrible psychopath who had no feelings. Sabina was puzzled and felt like she was attracting. She hoped that the empress would soon send him to war. She noticed that no one had lived in the room for a long time. It was in excellent condition. She looked luxurious. She wondered whose room it was. She looked around the room in surprise and wondered if her dad had really lived there. She sighed heavily and said that this simply couldn't. She thought that most likely his room would be turned into a warehouse. A moment later, she noticed something on the table. She looked at the table in surprise, as she noticed that there was some kind of crack there. The young lady came closer and noticed a leather notebook. Sabina was very surprised because she did not understand why the notebook was hidden in the. A moment later, the young lady heard noise and voices. She realized that she had to. The young lady hid the notebook behind her back so that no one would see it, and decided to quickly get out of. As she left the room, she noticed the maids walking down the corridor. The young lady was surprised because she did not understand why they were in such a hurry. A moment later, she saw Fabian, who said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time, but he wasn't particularly. The young lady looked at her brother in surprise. She didn't expect to see him so early. Fabian stood and looked at his sister with obvious contempt and anger. Sabina realized that all this commotion seemed to be caused by Fabian's arrival. The young lady froze, looking at her brother. She did not want to talk to him and wanted to leave. When she returned, she said that he must be tired after the journey and told him to rest. He asked what kind of attitude she had towards her. He said she was here because she wanted to be treated like a lady. He asked her if she thought she should be more polite to the future duke. She looked at her brother with fury because she knew that she had come to the mansion because of her mother. She knew that if she was still alive by the time Fabian became duke, she would surely be able to deal. Sabina said that she would no longer be in this mansion, and there was no point in her pleasing him. Fabian looked at her. He asked, puzzled, if she had really decided to show her true face, since she herself had brought up. Sabina knew that even if she died, she shouldn't even try to be friends with him. He looked at her with fury and said that he had been kind to her. He said that she eats his food and lives in his. He said angrily that she was an ungrateful girl and that she should be sent to a boarding school immediately. She looked at her in surprise. Fabian asked if she was scared. He told her to get on her knees and beg him for forgiveness. Sabina asked him with a smile if he could help her and asked the duke to send her to a boarding. She understood that if she went to boarding school, she would never meet a prince and she would be able to grow up and become. She said that since they both wanted it, he could go to the duke. Fabian asked if she looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand why he was going through all the trouble when he could have simply gone and asked. He looked at her and said that this was very stupid. Sabina said if he didn't have the courage, he could have just gotten out of the way. She said he shouldn't make her repeat it. Fabian was furious. He grabbed her by the hand and said that she was an impudent girl, but he miscalculated his strength. Fabian was surprised because he noticed that she had an injured leg. The young lady was in shock, so she realized that she had fallen and decided to touch whether the notebook was still. She sighed heavily as the notebook was in place, and she pressed it firmly so that it did. The young man was surprised. He came closer to her and asked why she was silent, and also asked what was wrong with her. The young lady was surprised. She did not understand why he was making so much noise. Sabina said that during the lesson, the madam hit her on the hand. Because Fabian was shocked, he looked at the young lady and asked how the madam dared to harm her. Sabina said that she is not a lady, and his father and Master Simon are the ones to be afraid of. She said that she wasn't badly hurt, but also asked why he was so angry, as if he looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. He asked with a smirk why he should be worried about her. He said he was just afraid that she would stay here forever. She looked at him with a smile, as she could clearly see that he was worried about. She looked at him and said that he could say this when she died. Fabian froze and he asked what she was talking about. He couldn't understand why she was saying such. She sighed heavily and asked if he could stop screaming so loudly. Sabina said he was right, and she said that he could go and rest now. Sabina said that she wouldn't be against the boarding school if he talked to the Duke. Fabian stared after her, wondering if she was joking. He partly shouted at her to stop immediately. Sabina understood that only one thing connected the family members, and that was her last name. The maid looked at the young lady and asked where she had gone. Sabina told Melissa to bring a cup of tea. Melissa was very scared because she heard loud sounds. Fabian was knocking on the door and shouting for his sister to. Melissa looked at the lady in surprise and asked what happened. Sabina said that it would not. Sabina told the maid that when he left, she should bring her some tea. The young lady looked at the notebook as she wanted to know whose it was. Fabian screamed furiously and asked his sister if she thought she could get away with it. He screamed at her not to ignore. A moment later, the Duke approached his son and asked what he was doing. The young man froze, looking at his father because he did not know how to tell him what had happened. Fabian said with a smile that he wanted to visit him as soon as he arrived. The Duke told his son that he could be heard in every corner of the mansion. Turning around, the Duke told his son to stop acting like a hysterical boy and to follow. Fabian bowed his head and agreed with his father. He immediately followed. Melissa looked at the lady and said that she brought her tea. Sabina thanked the maid. Melissa said in surprise that she had not seen this book before. Sabina said that she picked it up on the street and wanted to know. Melissa looked at the notebook in surprise and asked the lady if she found out who the author of the book was. Sabina said with a smile that she found out who the author was. There was a lot of noise and hubbub in the kitchen, as everyone was worried about the upcoming. The servants in turn cleaned the estate and prepared for the arrival of. The young lady was shocked because she could not sleep because of the noise. It was very noisy, and she wondered why they had started preparing so early in the morning. Well, of course she knew it was no small matter. 10 years ago, the current Duke's wife, Fabian's mother, died. Mr. Simon had been unhappy with his son's prolonged bachelor life. For a long time, Melissa called the lady. Sabina was shocked because she was still unable to get enough sleep. She thought she could sleep as much as she wanted because she had no. A moment later, she looked at her wound in surprise. Sabina asked the maid if the doctor had come. The maid said that the doctor had not returned. Sabina told the maid that she would get ready herself and could go out for a while. Melissa did not understand why she suddenly started talking. Melissa nevertheless agreed and told the lady that she could call her if she needed anything. Sabina looked at the burn site in surprise. She was in shock because the burn had completely disappeared and her leg was completely healthy. The young lady wondered who had done this if the doctor had not returned yet. She understood that no one in the mansion had such healing powers. She wondered how she was able to heal. There are only two types of people who are capable of healing: priests and magicians. But healing is the exclusive prerogative of priests. Many people turn to them for help in order to receive blessings and healing. But unfortunately in this world, nothing is done for free. The fact that the Charlotte family can afford a healer mage as their head doctor speaks volumes about how rich and powerful they are. The young lady understood that there was no one in the room except her. She took a knife and made a small cut on. A moment later, she noticed the cut quickly healing. The young lady was shocked by what she saw. She knew there was no doubt that this power came from her own body. She was shocked by this and wondered if she really was a magician. Usually abilities manifest naturally at the age of 10, but there are cases when this does not happen. In this case, you need to keep a magic stone with enormous magical power, or take it from another artificial magician. The madam looked at the young lady and said that they were done for. Today, Sabina thanked her for her. Madame said that even Monsieur Simon and the Duke had already given. Madame said that if there is magic in a person, it cannot be hidden. She was always looked down upon because when the magic was transfused, Sabina was in shock. She didn't understand why her magic manifested itself right now. She heard the maid calling her. Melissa said that the Duke asked her to come down. Sabina, puzzled, said that she knew she had to wait for the doctor to return. And since she was a healer mage, she might know more about her power. The young lady hoped that if she could use her power, she could heal her. She wanted to escape from this hellish place as soon as possible and be close to. Sabina wanted to get out of the estate and stay alive and live a quiet life away from. Walking down the corridor, she noticed Fabian standing and waiting for her. He looked at her in surprise and said that she had absolutely no taste in choosing a. Sabina didn't answer him. He said that she could ignore him as much as she wanted, but he knew. He asked her if she really wanted to go to the wilderness and be treated like a real duchess. He said that here, in fact, everyone knows who she is. He asked if she really wanted to pretend to be an innocent. She sighed heavily and said that he could think whatever he wanted. He told her not to think about it, because if she came, rumors would immediately spread, and she would become an. The Duke approached them and asked what they were talking about. The young man said with a smile that he missed his cousin very much, and now they were discussing the news. The Duke looked at his son and told him to be quiet and come. Sometime later, the servants introduced the mistress. Madame smiled and introduced herself. She said her name was Annabelle. She said with a smile that it was a great honor for her to be invited to the Charlotte family's ancestral. The Duke greeted her with a smile and said that they were happy to have her as their. Mr. Simon came closer to her and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. Annabelle asked, with a smile, how. Sabina knew that according to rumors, Madame Annabelle had also lost her husband several years, but looking at them, she could not say that for both of them, this was a second marriage. However, she knew that the lady was famous for her beauty. Annabelle told Fabian that she was glad to meet him, as he was a very outstanding young man, and everyone at the academy was talking about him. Fabian said with a smile that he was very glad that such a beautiful lady as she had heard of. He kissed her hand with all politeness, and she said with a smile that he was a real gent. Annabelle turned and looked at the weakness. Sabina bowed as she wanted to introduce herself, but before she could even utter a word, Annabelle said that they could go into the hall. She said that she was so nervous that she couldn't even have lunch, and she was very hungry. The young lady froze in surprise. Sabina was shocked because she had just been ignored. Sabina's parents said that they were married in a small church when they ran away from the Duke's house. But despite the legality of their marriage, Charlotte's family never recognized her mother because she was just a servant. Because of this, all members of the clan, even strangers, all hung the same label on her. Liam. But still, after this whole situation, Mrs. Annabelle's reaction was not. The ring did not surprise the young lady. She enjoyed because she saw that everything that was on the table, except the food, was. Mr. Simon looked at Annabelle and asked with a smile if the Count really said that. Madame said with a smile that he. Sabina watched her grandfather closely as he engaged in a casual conversation with Miss. She understood that because only the two of them were interested in this marriage, the others were in no hurry to join the conversation. She noticed that the Duke didn't care about them at all. She did not understand why Mr. Simon was fixated on his son's marriage. She wondered what was wrong with not marrying a second time after the death of his beloved. A moment later, the young lady caught the Duke's gaze. The Duke looked at her and called her. He said that she had no classes yet, but he still hoped that she continued. The young lady was surprised that the Duke addressed her specifically. A moment later, the young lady said that she was currently reading the literature that Madame had recommended. She was shocked and did not understand why he had. The Duke looked at her and asked what literature she was reading. She said that she was reading geographical and economic dynamics. In addition, she was trying to understand one article that described all the amendments made. She knew that it wasn't really for her age. She knew that it would come in handy in the future, since she had to earn her own money. When she got out of the estate, Fabian knew that there was nothing special. Madame said that the young lady seemed to be very clever and also asked if she had no governess. The Duke said that he had to fire her because of one incident. Madame Annabelle looked at the Duke and she said that children of Lady Sabina's age usually study in academies and try to establish contact. Madame said that boarding schools were becoming very common these days, and the Duke in turn slammed his glass. He looked at Annabelle in surprise and asked what boarding houses she was talking about. Annabelle looked at the Duke in surprise and said that he had no reason to retain custody of his brother's child. Sabina understood that Madame's words sounded reasonable, and the boarding house would be very. She also knew that there was one person who wanted to send her far away. She looked closely at her brother. Sabina looked at him intently, wondering if he really didn't want to speak out on the subject. He looked at her in surprise, because he did not understand what she wanted from him. The young lady was shocked, as he didn't say anything, and simply. Annabelle looked at the Duke and said that he was a very generous man, but Mr. Liam was too reckless and carefree. She said that as heir he had completely forgotten his duty and allowed the momentary desire to cloud his judgment. She said with a grin that it was very annoying, and then he made the wrong choice that ruined his life. She looked at the Duke and asked if that. An awkward and incomprehensible silence reigned between. Mr. Simon glanced sideways at his son. The Duke called Mrs. Annabelle. Annabelle said with a smile that she was saying all this because she was very sorry, and she was saying it without any ulterior motive. She looked sideways at the young lady and said, "Well, the gentleman didn't do anything wrong. He just naively believed." Sabina was shocked by this statement. It was unpleasant for her to hear something like this. The Duke looked intently at his niece. Their eyes. Annabelle sighed heavily and asked how some shameless maid could so easily seduce her own master. She asked if Master Liam really had an illegitimate child. The Duke looked at Mrs. Annabelle and called her. She looked at the Duke with a smile. The Duke said that he lags. She already managed to have lunch. He looked at her and with a sly smile asked if she thought it was time for her to go back. Annabelle looked at the Duke in surprise. He said that he was asking her to leave their mansion immediately. Mrs. Annabelle looked at the Duke in surprise, as she had not expected such a thing. The Duke looked at the maid and said that Beta had prepared the lady's things and carriage. Lady Annabelle told the Duke that she had no intention of offending them. The Duke looked at his father and said that since the engagement had fallen through, he thought it would be best to end it there. Annabelle was shocked. She said it was just a small thing. She wondered why he was Mrs. Annabelle turned to Mr. Simon, but the Duke looked at his lady and said that the main virtue in the relationship between spouses is respect. He looked at Mrs. Annabelle and asked who she thought had made the decision for Sabina to stay in this house. The Duke looked intently at his niece and said, Madame Annabelle, that he thought they were quite different in this respect. Sabina was in shock. She did not understand what this meant, because she understood that in any other situation, the Duke would not have even raised an eyebrow, and Sabina wondered if the Duke did not want outsiders to belittle the family's. Mistress Annabelle looked sideways at the young lady and said that no matter what anyone said, she was still a servant's daughter. Sabina was shocked by such statements. She understood that it was true, but it still hurt. The Duke looked at the lady and said that the young lady remained the daughter of his elder brother. The Duke said that, moreover, the maid whom she was so furiously throwing mud at was his first love. The Duke said that this was the love of his life. The Duke was angry that his brother's love was insulted. He looked at the lady and said that although Renata was not an aristocrat by blood, she looked more like a high-born woman than a woman who reveled in vile gossip. The Duke looked at Fabian and Sabina and said that the meal was over and it was time for them to return to their. The Duke looked at his niece in surprise. He noticed that she had not even moved from her place. A moment later, he asked how her leg was, as he thought she was having difficulty moving. The young lady said in a trembling voice that she was in shock and did not know what to do, because she understood that the Duke had cancelled the engagement because of her. She was afraid to look up because she understood that Mr. Simon. A moment later, she saw the Duke approach her and Sabina looked at the Duke in surprise and called. A moment later, the Duke took his niece in his arms. She was very surprised, as she did not expect. The Duke looked at the young lady and said that he would carry her to her room. The servants looked at the Duke in surprise They did not expect something like this from him. The young lady looked at the Duke and said that she would go herself, and he could let her go. But the Duke said that in that case, Sabina said that she was simply frightened when the lady raised her voice, and now she was fine and he could let her go. But the Duke did not answer. Sabina looked at him in surprise as he did not answer or let. She held him closer and wondered what was wrong with her, as she felt so comfortable in his arms. Sabina was shocked and understood that it was just awful, since she didn't know what would happen if Mr. Simon got angry with her. But she was more shocked by the Duke, since he never even stroked her head. She did not know what was going on in his head. The young lady said, looking down at the Duke, that he should not have treated his lady like that. After all, they were soon to be. The Duke sighed heavily and said that this was not at all necessary. Benjamin said that he never wanted this at all. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise. The Duke said that he had offered the Fabian the title of Duke, but he had refused. So if she were to become his wife, it would bring a lot of trouble. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise, as she had previously thought that it. Now she realized that the Duke had planned to break off the engagement from the very beginning. She wondered if this was a scene to rid him of Mrs. Annabel. She thought that most likely he had even managed to discuss this with Mr. Simon, but she was still very glad that it was not her fault. Some time later, the Duke brought the young lady to her own. The Duke carefully placed her on the bed. The young lady, without looking up, thanked the Duke for his help. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said that he had wanted to ask her something for a long time. Sabina looked at him in surprise. The Duke asked why she still addressed him by his title. The young lady did not expect such a question. A moment later she said that he was a duke, and that was why she addressed him like that. The Duke said that from now on she could call him uncle, and she should also address her grandfather accordingly. She looked at him in surprise as he said that. The young lady looked at him and said that no matter how she addressed them both, they would not begin to treat her as a member of the family. She looked intently at the Duke and asked why all this was. The young lady sighed heavily, as she wished she could tell him so. The Duke looked at her and said that no one would dare insult her, and she must remember that she is Charlotte. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she understood everything. As he left, the Duke told her to rest. The young lady stared after him. She was shocked by everything that was happening. The young lady went to bed and wondered if such a situation had ever happened in the story of. The Charlotte family controls some part of the empire, so they were often mentioned in the novel. When Ricardo seized the imperial throne, she didn't remember the details of their family life, but the Duchess was definitely not there. But anyway, she was glad that the Duke was not, since she knew she wouldn't be bullied by the new family member. Sabina knew things weren't as bad as she expected. Melissa looked at the young lady and asked if she needed to take a bigger bag. Sabina said that there was no need for it, and this would be enough for her. The maid looked at the lady in surprise and asked if she was really taking only clothes with her. Sabina understood that while the prince was at the estate, she still wouldn't be able to go anywhere, but she still wondered if she should have brought her notebook with her. Fabian came into her room and looked at her with fury. He asked her if it wasn't enough for her to ruin her father's life. He looked at her with contempt and anger and asked if she really wanted to interfere with his father's wedding. The young lady didn't even look at him. She said that he didn't fully understand what the appearance of a new mistress in the man. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She said that if his father married again, he would have a brother or sister, and this child could become the heir. He looked at her dumbfounded and asked if she thought he didn't understand that. The young lady looked at him intently. He said that he was not against this marriage, only because he said that even if the father had another child, when he started walking, he would already be in a. Sabina said that the child would have a living mother, and this was a huge advantage for the Duke of Hammer, so that this child would just have time to grow up. By the time the title was transferred, Sabina asked him if he really thought that the Count. Sabina said that when the Duke mentioned that Fabian would be the heir, Lady Annabel's family turned them down. Sabina told him not to make a mountain out of a mole. The young man looked at his sister in surprise and asked if his father had not married because of. Fabian looked away with a grin in turn. He was glad about this turn of. The young lady looked at him closely and realized that he was just a simple. The young lady looked at the maid and said that they could go now. Fabian followed his sister. He looked at her in surprise and asked me how high will it be for her, as it is the 4th floor and his legs are falling off. The young lady was surprised as she realized that all this time he was walking behind them. Walking down the corridor, she noticed that it was not bad here, even for an attic. She hoped that the prince would not get to her. The maid looked at the young lady and said that when they entered the room, they were very taken aback and surprised, as they did not expect. The maid was shocked by this room. She did not expect that her young mistress would be sent to live in such a. Fabian, in turn, froze in surprise. He was shocked by. They looked at the room in surprise as they saw that it was very dusty and dirty. Fabian shouted in anger as he wondered why the room was in such a deplorable state. Fabian looked at the room in surprise and asked if it was his father who moved her here. He was in shock and did not understand. He walked closer to his sister and asked if this was a warehouse. He wanted to hear the answer, but she just ignored him. A moment later, she asked if he could see. The young lady was shocked as she realized that she had been naive and had believed in the Duke's kindness. Because of yesterday, she understood that she would not have been given this room without the Duke's. The young man looked at the maid and told her to answer his question. He looked at her with fury and asked what kind of room this was. The maid froze in place as she did not know what to answer. A moment later, she said in a trembling voice that she was asking for Vanessa, but she simply ignored her. Fabian looked at the maid in surprise, and Melissa looked at Fabian and said that she would immediately carry out his instructions. Sometime later, Vanessa came to them and asked with a grin if they really called her. Vanessa said that she just wanted to show the. Sabina was shocked because she saw that Vanessa just wanted to piss her off. Sabina was standing in front of her, but she again pretended that she was. Melissa told the young lady that she had spoken to Vanessa about it, but she always pretended not to notice. Sabina knew that from the moment she moved into the mansion, Vanessa ignored her, and no matter what happened to her, she always had nothing to do. The young gentleman looked at Vanessa and asked what she was thinking. Vanessa looked at the gentleman in surprise and said that she didn't understand anything. Fabian asked her furiously what she was thinking when she chose this room. He asked Vanessa if she really thought this room was suitable for. Sabina looked at her brother and told him to stop the charade. Vanessa said it was a personal order from Mr. Everyone froze in surprise as they could not. Vanessa looked sideways at the young lady with a smirk on her face. Sabina looked at her brother and said that there was nothing wrong with it, but Fabian was in shock. He looked at her in surprise and asked what it meant. Sabina told him to calm down and not. She looked at him and said furiously that she would just stay here. The young man looked at her in surprise. Fabian looked at the maids and told them to leave, as Melissa looked at the head maid in surprise and asked if Mr. Simon had really allocated this room for the. Vanessa said that was exactly it, and he himself told them to prepare an inconspicuous. Vanessa asked with a smirk if this room wasn't fit for a lady. Vanessa knew that this was the only room suitable for the handmaid's daughter. Fabian looked at his sister angrily and asked if she really wanted to stay in this room. He told her not to be stupid. He also said that he knew she hated him. But now the young lady laughed. Fabian looked at his sister in surprise. She looked at him in surprise and asked why. She asked with a smirk on her face why he thought that this had anything to do with her personal relationship with him. The young man was surprised and asked her how she could say such things to a person who. She told him to bow and ask properly, and then maybe she would listen to him. He was furious. Fabian told her to watch her words, as his patience had its limits. She looked at him in surprise, and Sabina asked him if he didn't understand why the maid did that. She said that he also didn't know the reason why she had to move into the attic of the extension. If an illegitimate child is introduced to a prince, it will be a shameful stain on the family's reputation, and that is why everyone tries to hide it. She said that he and his father were involved in this, and even his grandfather does not want to show it to anyone, so as not to disgrace the honor of the family. Sabina screamed furiously that they would never accept her as a member of the family. The young man froze in place, not knowing what to answer her. He was stunned. She looked at him and said that he didn't seem to understand yet. She said with fury that she hated him. because he was worse than Vanessa, worse than those maids. She shouted that he was the worst of all. Sabina said that if it had gotten through to him now, she told him not to interfere and to go back to his academy. She screamed angrily at him to stop pestering her. The young man froze in bewilderment. Her words hurt. He came closer to her and said that he understood very well what she meant by not interfering. Fabian walked out of the room in a rage. The young lady froze in place. She was in shock at what happened. She felt as if this space gave her the opportunity to Everyone said she was the disgrace of the Charlotte family and a despicable half-breed, the fruit of a summer love that led to Papa's. She didn't know what to do because she couldn't leave things like that. She was in shock and she simply didn't have the strength. It seemed to her that the most important thing was to avoid meeting the prince. But now she was thinking only about the Charlotte family and how disappointed she was in them. She didn't want to stay here. Sabina thought that if she could anger her brother, he would boldly, but still, she did not understand why he behaved this way and wondered why he suddenly began to pity her. She wondered who could send her away. She wanted to go to the Duke and ask him to send her to boarding school, but she still knew that was not an option, since it was the very reason he had refused his engagement to Lady Annabelle, and therefore he would not allow. She thought that there was something she should go to Mr. Simon, and he would send. She understood that it was only in his power. She thought that he would do it very quickly and easily, because she knew that he hated. Sabina thought about what she needed to contact Mr. Simon, but the problem was that during these 3 years of her interruptions here, they never once spoke alone. She understood that she needed an assistant who knew the gentleman well. She glanced sideways at the diary and decided to read. Sabina came into the kitchen and said that she needed a kitchen and a person. Vanessa looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she could find out the reason and what exactly brought her here. Sabina said that she would like to cook something, and it would not. Vanessa said with a grin that she understood, and the kitchen could be at her disposal, but working hours were already over, and she had no right to detain the girl. Vanessa sighed heavily and said with a grin that she didn't know if anyone could voluntarily. Vanessa looked at the maids and said that it turned out that everyone was in a hurry to get. Vanessa looked at the young lady and asked her permission to take her leave. Vanessa was already leaving when suddenly Sabina looked at Vanessa with a smile and asked if she knew how Madame Clarissa was. Vanessa looked at the young lady in surprise and asked why she was asking about this. Sabina said that the lady had gone too far. Sabina looked at Vanessa and said that she was only using words. Sabina asked if she really believed that this would make the punishment. Vanessa looked at the lady with a smirk and disdain and said that her word was taken into account. Sabina smiled and said that she hoped so. Vanessa, in turn, looked at the young lady with anger and contempt. The maids and the rest looked at the young lady and said that it was time for them. A moment later, there was no one left in the kitchen, and Sabina was left alone. A few minutes later, Melissa arrived. Sabina looked at the maid with a smile and asked if she had brought what she had been in. Melissa smiled and said to the lady that she brought everything to her here. The young lady knew that she should have expected that Vanessa would not help her. Melissa said she did not expect or think that Mr. Simon could have in. Melissa said that he was not the type of person to give others a reason to doubt that they were in perfect health. She said that she did not fully believe this rumor, but his personal maid confirmed it. Melissa looked at the lady and asked how she knew this. Sabina sighed heavily and said that. The young lady looked at the diary with a smile as she realized that it was her father's diary. She read it over and over again. Every time she had time, she thought about her father who spent his teenage years here in the Yveton house. She noticed that his every word was imbued with care and sincerity. He wrote that after his mother's death, his father's insomnia only worsened. He became addicted to alcohol, even though he had hated it before. He was afraid to imagine how hard it would be for him to accept that his mother was no longer. He wrote that when his mother was still alive, she often prepared tea with chamomile and honey for her husband. He wrote that the walls of their house had already forgotten its sweet. Sabina remembered these lines because they did not sound like an ordinary father, and still it was unexpected for her to learn such news, since it seemed to her that it was impossible for a person who seemed to have no flaws to be sleepless. Although she understood that this was an excellent chance, Melissa looked at the lady in surprise and asked why she suddenly decided to go to Miss. Melissa looked at the lady in surprise and asked what happened, as she had never done. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she thought that if she sat with her hands folded, she would soon. She understood that she did not want to resort to such a method at all, but still she had no other choice, since she needed to escape from here as soon as. Sabina knew she had to push her emotions aside. Sabina winced in surprise as she heard her. Melissa looked at her mistress with a smile and tears in her eyes. She said that she tries to be an exemplary granddaughter, even though the master is. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise. She did not understand what she was talking about. Melissa looked at the walnuts and asked if they could just serve them unpeeled. The young lady said that was not. Melissa looked at the lady in surprise and said that she just wanted to bring him some tea. Melissa asked why the nuts were needed. Sabina said that she had heard that walnuts help with insomnia. Mr. Simon looked at the young lady in surprise and asked why she had come to. Sabina understood that she had to be brave in this situation because her life depended. Sabina looked at him. She understood that he was no more terrible than death. Sabina knew she had to follow the plan exactly. She looked at him and said with a smile that she would like to talk to him a little. She asked with a smile if he could spare some time for her over. Mr. Simon looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she really wanted to talk at such. He looked at the young lady for some time, intently, and sighed. But a moment later, he smelled a familiar scent, and Mr. Simon told her she could come. The young lady thanked him and slowly followed. She was very happy because she understood that she had succeeded. And now all that was left was a. She was sure that he would approve her request to send her to boarding school. She was sure that he would agree. The maid slowly brought tea to the table. Sabina looked at the maid and said that she could leave them there. The maid bowed and carried out her mistress's. Mr. Simon looked intently at his cup of tea. Sabina slowly walked up and took the teapot. She wanted to pour tea. Mr. Simon looked intently at his cup of tea. The young lady smiled at the gentleman and told him to try the tea. The gentleman looked at the cup in surprise and said that the tea was very sweet. He wanted to tell her that her grandmother was making tea, but stopped before he could finish. He looked at the plate of nuts in surprise and asked what they were, as they did not look like ordinary. The young lady smiled and told him to try them. Sabina said that these walnuts roasted in maple syrup tea were sweet, so she thought it would be worth choosing a dessert with a less pronounced flavor. Mr. Simon tried it and said he liked it very. She looked at the gentleman and said that she had heard that walnuts help with insomnia, so she asked him to eat some. He looked at her in surprise and asked how she knew about him. She said that he always works hard for the good of the family, both physically and mentally. She said that she would like him to be able to rest at least one night. Mr. Simon looked at her in surprise and asked if she really prepared. The young lady looked down and said that she had asked Vanessa, but she had refused her, so she had to. Mr. Simon was furious. He said that the head maid had crossed the boundaries of decency. He asked with fury how the servant dared to disobey the order. Mr. Simon said that he would call Vanessa later and make sure that she apologized to her. The young lady thanked him. Sabina understood that this time Mr. Simon's domineering character was to her advantage, since Vanessa had ignored her again and in turn had missed a point. Sabina knew that as long as she was part of the Charlotte family, Monsieur Simon would not allow the servants to treat her although it was not she who prepared the dessert, but Melissa. No one knows about it, because at that moment, Vanessa and the other maids had already left. The gentleman looked at the young lady and asked what she wanted to talk to him about. He looked at the young lady and asked what really brought her here. She looked at him with a sharp gaze and said that she actually wanted to apologize. The master looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She said that she was the cause of the Duke's conflict with Madame Annabelle Simon, told her that it was not her. The young lady understood that they had definitely discussed this point. She knew she was just part of a performance. She said it was inappropriate to talk about it then, but she still thought the lady's offer wasn't. The gentleman looked at her in surprise and asked what proposal she was talking about. Sabina said that she was talking about the boarding school. Mr. Simon looked at the young lady in surprise and asked why she wanted to. Sabina froze in surprise as she didn't expect him to ask her. She knew she couldn't tell him her real reason why she wanted to leave, because the reason was that she hated them and this house, and she didn't want to die at the hands of the prince. She sighed heavily, and Mr. Simon said that she was weak. He said that she was still too young to travel so far alone. She looked at him in surprise and said that Fabian entered the academy at the gentleman said that this boy was the heir of the family and no one would dare touch him. He was not there. The gentleman said that she was different, since her origins made her an easy. Sabina froze in place, as she was very surprised. She did not expect him to say such a thing, as she thought that he would happily. The gentleman said that this was the reason he was so concerned about her, and that she had impeccable manners. He said that if she happened to meet someone who wanted to humiliate her, she would be above that. He said that he was saying that a Charlotte lady must be strong enough to ridicule and crush anyone who dares to emphasize her origin. He said that until she was ready, she shouldn't even think about leaving the. Mr. Simon looked at the young lady and said that it was for her. The young lady was shocked, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She understood that the man who had personally belittled her throughout her childhood and had not taken her origin into account was now behaving like a real grandfather. She understood that he could punish Vanessa and the others as maids, but Sabina knew perfectly well that this was only for the sake of preserving the family's reputation. She understood that her own family did not take her into account. The young lady sighed heavily. She understood that she had not gotten what she wanted, and she no longer intended to continue playing the diligent granddaughter. She looked at the gentleman and said that it was time for her. Mr. Simon looked at the young lady and called her. She looked at him in surprise. He looked at his granddaughter and asked if she could sometimes serve him such. Sabina wondered if she had actually succeeded in awakening his memories of his wife. The young lady felt her grandfather's gaze on her. She said with a smile that he could come to Perestroika, and she would definitely treat him to tea. She was interested in how he would feel about seeing her in the room. He had thrown her out. She looked at him and said with a grin that she herself could not come, because in 2 days the prince would arrive at the estate. She understood that alas, they would not send her to a boarding school, which meant that she would not be able to legally leave the mansion. She wondered if she should just run away from the estate. The head maid came to the young lady and asked for forgiveness. She said that she was wrong. Vanessa looked intently at the young lady, but the notable in turn did. A moment later, Sabina asked her what exactly she had done wrong. She said that she had given her a room that was not in keeping with her status. She asked to forgive her for her The young lady looked at Vanessa intently, as the very day had come when this woman bowed her head before. Sabina looked at her and asked if that was all. She asked if Vanessa and her maids had done nothing. Vanessa said she had nothing more to say in her defense. Sabina knew she didn't expect anything more from her. She glanced sideways at the head maid and said. The young lady looked at the head maid in surprise, as she did not understand why she did not leave. Vanessa said in a trembling voice that Mr. Simon was asking Sabina to consider her daughter as a possible friend. She said that if the young lady allowed it, she would Vanessa said that she could become her faithful assistant. The young lady looked at Vanessa in surprise. A moment later, she remembered telling Mr. Simon that she wanted to make friends. She wondered if this was how he wanted to take. The young lady looked at Vanessa with a smirk as he suggested Vanessa's daughter as. Sabina understood that she would now have a host. The young lady looked at the head maid and said that now she and her daughter would become. Sabina looked at Vanessa and asked her to remind her how old her daughter was. Vanessa said with a trembling voice that her daughter turned 12 this. Sabina asked what the young lady's name was. Vanessa said that her daughter's name was Viv. Sabina looked at the head maid and said that apparently she was also a maid. Sabina said that it seemed like Vanessa didn't like Mr. Simon. Vanessa said that was correct. The young lady looked at the head maid and said that she understood. The young lady looked at Vanessa and said that she thought she knew that she was different from the other ladies. Sabina asked Vanessa if she knew exactly how. Sabina said that, for example, she could beat each other up or go somewhere with him, but return. Vanessa looked at the young lady in shock and said that she was wrong. She said that she realized her mistake and she begged the young lady on her knees not to do this to her daughter. Sabina was in shock. She wondered what she had done wrong and why she had to endure the bullying of others for so many years. Vanessa came closer to her and on her knees asked her for forgiveness. She told Sabina that from now on, she would. The young lady looked at the maid with contempt. She thought that Vanessa's behavior was disgusting. This woman looked at her like she was dirt, and now she was on her knees begging her. Sabina looked at the maid and asked if she could do her one favor. In that case, Vanessa was surprised and stunned. Looking at the young lady, she said that she would do anything for her. Sabina looked at her and smiled and told her to find out the prince's schedule and tell her. Vanessa looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Sabina said that she was forbidden to cross paths with the prince, and she did not want to accidentally. Vanessa said, in a trembling voice, that she had no right to. Sabina looked at her intently, expecting a different answer. Sabina looked at her, made a mouth, and said that her grandfather had warned her. She said that if Vanessa decided to act arbitrarily again and did not obey, then she. Sabina looked at Vanessa and asked if she understood that she would have to tell the gentleman everything. Vanessa looked at the young lady angrily. A moment later she said that she would do everything. The young lady looked at Vanessa with a smile and said that it was the right decision. Sabina said that the teenagers are still too young to leave their parents, but she doesn't know how she will feel about Vanessa after the prince. Sabina looked at Vanessa and said that she was sure she understood what Vanessa, looking at the lady, said that she understood everything. Sabina said that this was very good, and from now on, she would watch her close. Vanessa left the young lady's room with lightning speed. Melissa looked at the young lady and said that she was amazing and asked who taught her such a. Melissa looked at the lady and said that she was an adult, but still could not say a word to Vanessa. The young lady looked sideways at the maid and asked what she was taught. Sabina understood that this was just contempt towards Vanessa. Melissa said that when she was little, she could only quietly swear at the door if it pinched her finger and nothing more. Sabina said that this was also not bad. Looking at Melissa, she noticed a wonderful child who was a joy to his. Sabina knew that there were those who treated children with understanding, realizing that they were still small, and those who brushed them. She wondered if she would be given a chance to grow up peacefully if she quietly survived the prince's arrival. She understood that being little was disgusting. A look that can't inspire fear, a body that can't survive without outside help. People think that the smaller a person is, the stupider. She realized that this is the anniversary of her father's death, after a year of living in the mansion. On the anniversary of her father's death, she was lonely. The young lady trembled and cried. She called for her. At that moment she felt completely like a little child. The maid looked at the young lady and asked for forgiveness. She said that Master Simon had ordered that no one should. Sabina looked at the maid and asked her. She said that she would also. The maid looked at the young lady closely and agreed with her, but said that she needed to wait a little. Sabina was looking for Mr. Simon because she wanted to ask him to let her go with him to the memorial service. She hoped that they could become a real. But the master angrily asked the maid how the young lady dared to show up at the threshold of his room. Knowing that he could not send her back, he could not understand her, and asked the maid if she had really gone. He shouted furiously and asked the maid how the young lady had the audacity to come to him. The maid looked closely at the young lady as she realized that she had heard everything. Sabina said that she understood everything and left. She didn't want to listen to him anymore. She understood that she had behaved stupidly since she knew from the very beginning who they were. But she still hoped that they could become a family. But after his words, she realized that there was no place for her in this mansion, and no family. That night, she realized that she would spend her entire childhood in complete solitude. Unlike the real Sabina, she pretended to be an adult, based only on memory. The young lady read the prince's schedule with a smile. She was glad to have received it. He would spend most of his time on the fencing ground. She understood that if he was in the annex, he would definitely not run. She noticed that he would be attending Sunday services. She realized that while the prince was in their temple, she would be able to come to the mansion. Melissa informed the young lady that Dr. Eugenia had arrived. Sabina said that Eugenia greeted the lady with a smile and said that they hadn't seen each other for a long. She looked at the young lady and asked if she had a burn. Sabina said that she did, and she accidentally spilled. Eugenia looked at the young lady and said that she was told that she had developed blisters, and it looked like it was very. She said she wanted to take off the bandage and examine the burn site, but when she took off the bandage, she was very surprised. She looked at the young lady and said there was no burn. She looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she had lied. Sabina said that when she woke up, he was no longer. Eugenia sighed heavily and told the young lady that it was clever of her to lie in order to get rid of Madame Clarissa. She said that in that. Sabina looked at her and said that the Duke had thrown Madame out because he had seen the burn with his. Sabina said that she was not lying, since there was not even a scar left. Eugenia looked at the young lady in surprise. Sabina told the doctor that if she didn't believe, then she would prove. Sabina took the knife in her hand and cut her palm. Eugenia was in. She ran up to the young lady and asked what she was doing. She said that the wound needed to be bandaged, but a moment later, the doctor saw that there was no wound. She looked at the young lady in surprise and asked how this was possible. The young lady looked at Eugenia in surprise and asked why she had not handed her over to the Duke, since she thought she. Eugenia hesitated, not knowing what to answer. Sabina thought that it was most likely out of pity or compassion. Madame looked at the doctor and said that she was waiting for her, as Lady Sabina needed. Madame Clarissa sighed heavily and said that it was very difficult for her to raise such an ignorant. The doctor spoke very easily about what happened to Madame, because she saw it all. The young lady looked at her and asked if she didn't want to be bullied. Sabina asked if she could count on her help. She looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what kind of help she was talking about. Sabina said that she would ask her not to tell the Duke about her ability. Eugenia looked at the young lady in surprise and said that it was a great gift, and she could not remain silent. She said that sooner or later, she herself would. Sabina said that if the elders found out, they would immediately find her a mentor, and she was worried that the person would be like Madame Clarisse. The young lady sighed heavily and said that until she was sure that she could protect herself better, Sabina knew that this was a pure lie, since such a rare ability would be immediately put into circulation. But she did not want to die at the hands of the. She understood that for this reason, it was impossible to allow the Duke and Lord Simon to find out about her ability. Eugenia sighed heavily and agreed with the young lady. She said that if Sabina quit, she would not tell. Sabina looked at her and asked if she thought she could heal another person. Eugenia said with a smile that if. She said that healing means caring, and caring for yourself is not just the beginning. In the future, she will be able to heal others, but for this, she needs to engage in. She said that it was of course a miracle, but still not a divine power. Sabina sighed heavily and said that it seemed like she was of no use right now. Sabina asked how long it would take for her to be able to do anything. She understood that at the moment, she was not able to heal her. She looked at the young lady and told her to start studying now, since she lived in the annex, which meant no one would disturb her. Eugenia said with a smile that 2 days a week, 2 hours of classes, and she would make a great. Sabina was surprised that Eugenia wanted to teach her personal. Sabina understood that Dr. Eugenia was an outstanding healer, and besides, she taught in many educational institutions. She knew that the doctor was good to her and good at teaching, but still she could not accept such help. The young lady sighed heavily and said that this would not do, since she had no money to pay for the lesson. She looked at the young lady and said with a soft smile that no normal adult would be afraid. Sabina looked at her in surprise. She said that they pay for tuition at the academy. Eugenia said with a smile that it was the parents who did it, but not the child. She said that she would teach her during working hours. So if you think about it, she was already getting paid for her. The young lady was confused. She didn't know if she could accept such generous help. Eugenia looked at the young lady and asked if she could borrow the knife for a second. Sabina looked at her and asked why she suddenly wanted to take the knife. The young lady noticed that the doctor had cut herself, and she was surprised and stunned, and asked her what. Eugenia showed a large wound on her hand and said, "Young lady, Although she is a healer, she cannot unknowingly heal her own wounds, except for the situation when her life is in. The young lady looked at the wound in surprise. Eugenia looked at the young lady and said that the power within her was so great that it healed even scratches and wounds invisible to. The young lady looked at her hands in surprise and asked if her power was really that great. Eugenia told Sabina with a smile that for this reason, one day, Eugenia smiled and told Sabina that if she didn't mind, she would like to receive a long-term agreement about the power that Sabina wasn't even sure of. She didn't know if she really had such outstanding abilities or if the doctor just wanted to She didn't know it, but one thing is for sure, it was the first time she encountered someone who didn't demand anything from her in return for help. For some reason she felt. Sabina looked at her and asked when she would get rid of the scratch. Eugenia used magic and the scratch healed on her hand. She looked at the young lady and asked if she was scared when she suddenly picked up the knife. Eugenia said with a smile that she was scared. And she also asked Sabina not to harm herself, even if it was absolutely. The doctor said that although the wound would heal in a couple of seconds, she did not want the young lady to hurt herself. A healer must first of all heal others. The young lady understood that it was for this very reason that she wanted to develop her ability. She spent 3 years in the mansion. But during all this time, no one told her that her mother's condition had even. She knew that with the wealth and power of the Charlotte family, she could be cured quickly and easily. She didn't know what was going on and wondered if Mr. Simon hadn't intended to help her from the start. Sabina knew she couldn't wait. She wanted to become stronger and cure her mother herself. The knight informed the prince that they had arrived at the estate. He said that it seemed to him that the main building was still far away, and that the rumors were not lying, and that it was an incredibly huge territory. The knight looked at the prince and said that he must be careful. The prince looked at the knight in surprise and asked what he should be wary of. The knight said that he should be wary of what happened. The prince looked at the knight with a grin and asked if he was really talking about the prince trying to kill Her Majesty. The prince sighed heavily and said that his mother was very. The prince asked with a smirk on his face, how could a son attack his own mother? The knight froze in bewilderment. He was shocked by the prince. The knight knocked on the room and shouted, but no one answered. A moment later, the knight saw the doors open and a bloody prince emerge from the room. The knight was stunned. He didn't expect to see something like this. If his gaze was filled with the desire to kill, then one could say that he was sick and there was no emotion in the prince's eyes, just complete indifference. The prince came closer to the knight and told him not to look at him, because suddenly someone might get. The duke greeted the prince at the Everton house. Looking at the prince, the duke introduced himself. He said that he was the head of the Charlotte family, and his name was Benjamin. The Duke said with a smile on his face that it was an honor for them to receive His Highness, even though his visit would not last. The Empress sat on the ground in bloody clothes, breathing heavily and shaking with fear. She asked her son who she was to. The prince, in turn, did not answer his mother. The Empress looked at him intently and said that he could answer her at least something. She asked him again who he considered her. She asked him if he had any feelings at all, and also asked if he had ever smiled sincerely. She asked if one of his loved ones died, would he shed a tear. The prince looked at the Empress intently. He said nothing to her, since Ricardo was. She looked at her son and asked if he understood why she was crying now. Ricardo understood better than anyone that he was abnormal. The prince looked at the Empress intently and said calmly that he did not understand her. He understood that there was no sense in the Empress. Fabian entered the room and called out to the prince with a smile. Fabian asked the prince if he liked the room. The prince sighed heavily and said that the prince said that this room was so worthy that he was already looking forward to his future life in the mansion. Fabian smiled and said that he was very glad. Fabian was very glad that he personally volunteered to give a tour of the house, as he knew that he and the prince were the same age, and they would surely become. Fabian looked at the prince and said with a smile that they could explore the garden some more. The prince looked at the young man and said that he would like to ask him. Fabian looked at the prince in surprise and asked what he wanted. Prince Ricardo said they had spoken about the Duchess earlier. The prince looked at the Duke and said that he had heard that you still lived at the estate. And the lady prince asked why she had not come out to. Mr. Simon said that his granddaughter had fallen ill, and they had decided that it was worth sending her to the provinces for a speedy recovery. The gentleman said that they were extremely sorry that she could not greet the prince in person. The prince looked at Mr. Simon with surprise and a smile, and said that he understood that she was. The prince looked at Fabian and asked how seriously the young lady was ill, since he had heard earlier that she was still young. And since she was already suffering from an illness, it was very terrible and unfortunate. Fabian looked at the prince in surprise and timidly said that she was not really ill. The prince looked at the young man in surprise and asked why in that case you didn't introduce her to. Fabian sighed heavily and told the prince that he thought he knew that she was not of the most noble birth, and that adults were ashamed of her, which is why she was forbidden to. The prince said with a grin that he was not one to judge people solely by their origin. Fabian froze in surprise, as he did not expect such an. Fabian remembered that last time his sister was indignant that she was not allowed to show herself to the prince. Fabian wondered if now was the right moment. Fabian knew that the young lady was not allowed to meet the prince, but if she did see him once, then after that she would say thank you to him. Fabian looked at the prince with a grin and said. The maid looked at the young lady and said that he was Mr. Fabian, waiting for her at the back palace, and asked her to come down. The young lady sighed heavily and said that the maid should tell her that. The young lady wondered why she suddenly dropped everything she was doing and ran to meet. Sabina looked at the maid and said that if he had important business, then let him come to her himself. The maid bowed and said that she would convey her words to the man. Sabina understood that whoever might come today, the prince was supposed to come to the estate, and she couldn't go out. She knew that if he bumped into her while they. Fabian burst into her room and asked how she had the nerve to refuse to talk. He looked at her angrily and breathed heavily. The young lady looked at her brother and said she thought they had told each other everything. Last time he looked at his sister and said she was the only one talking, and God had done it. She looked at him with a fixed gaze, and he said that he had said earlier that he understood everything. She did not understand why he came to her and what he was going. The young man looked at his sister and said that he didn't think she had such. Sabina sighed heavily and asked how he knew what it was like to be left all alone. She said that he never felt remorse, even when he mocked his. Fabian said angrily that now was not the time for bickering, and that they needed to go down. And the young lady looked at her brother with a gray expression and told him to work on his manners. She told him not to ignore her anymore, and she didn't. He looked at her and said that she would be touched when she found out why he had called her. The young lady sighed heavily and said that. Fabian said he just wanted to fulfill her wish. He was shocked because she didn't want to go with him. He looked at her and said that he actually had his own things. The young lady understood that he was up to something, but she didn't know what. A moment later, Fabian snatched the notebook. The young lady screamed furiously at him not to touch the notebook. She didn't want anyone else touching her dad's diary. She looked at him and angrily told him to put it back while she asked nicely. He looked at her with a smirk and asked what she intended to do to him. Sabina screamed for him to give her the diary back, as it was very important to her. He said with a grin that in that case she could catch up with him, and the young lady was shocked and shouted after him. But he did not deviate from. Sabina understood that she had to immediately catch up with him and take back what was rightfully hers, since this was all that was left to her. While running through the garden, she noticed her brother. She broke through the rose bushes, but a moment later she stopped and froze. She was in shock and didn't know what to do. The young lady understood that a prince was now standing in front of her, and this moment became the most difficult test in her. She was shocked and understood that her brother was just a vile scoundrel, since her life would now be shortened very much out. Fabian said that he thought the prince knew that the young lady was not of the most noble origin, and that adults were ashamed of her, so they locked her out of seeing the prince. Before that, but now he was finally convinced that young Charlotte was very much mistaken. After all, he is a prince who was unofficially banished from the palace for trying to kill his mother, hiding a duchess just to make a good impression. Ricardo looked out the window and noticed that it was just a backyard. The prince knew that they shouldn't have hidden the young lady from him. Ricardo understood that they would do everything to prevent their meeting from taking place. He understood that there was only one reason that could explain this. The adults wanted to protect the young lady from the mad. However, now he realized that their efforts were in vain, since their meeting was in. Ricardo looked at the young lady and said that it was disrespectful of her to behave like that. He looked at her and asked if her elders had not warned her that a guest had arrived at their estate. He said that although he believed that in that case, she would have known who exactly had arrived. The prince understood that Fabian had studied at the academy, but he was still an idiot. The prince saw that the young lady was so scared that she didn't even try to hide it. At first, he planned to take her to the Duke to see his reaction, but she looked so pitiful that he simply lost all desire. He was shocked and wondered if he had scared her that much. A moment later, the prince saw that she had knelt down. The young lady kneeling bowed low and greeted the prince. In a trembling voice, she said that she had not expected to meet the gentleman here and had behaved disrespectfully. She begged him for his condescension. The prince looked at the young lady and asked. She sighed heavily and said that her name was Vivian, and she was a friend. That was the name of the maid's daughter, whom Mr. Simon wanted to introduce to her. She understood that she was of some use now. She understood that he should under no circumstances find out that she was. The prince came closer to her and told her to raise her head and stand. A moment later, the young lady obediently carried out his order. The prince looked at her intently and asked if she was really the young lady's. She bowed and said that it was just like that, and that she kept her company during game. The prince looked at her with a grin and said that he had heard that the Duke had adopted the daughter of his brother, who had died several. She said that if his visit had taken place earlier, she believed they could have met. She said that she was very sorry that they had not met. Bowing, she said that with his permission she would leave. The prince looked at her and said that he had heard that the young lady was ill and was now in the. Looking at her, he asked why she did not go with her. Sabina was trembling. She said that her mother was the head maid, so she was forbidden to leave the mansion. And who could mistress was feeling very bad and could not play. So she. The young lady looked at the prince intently. She knew he was provoking her. She was shocked and wondered if he realized she had lied to him. The prince looked at her with a smile and said that since the young lady had left, she would help him in the. Sabina was surprised by the prince's statement. She did not expect to hear something like that. The prince looked at her and said that during his stay in the mansion, she would become his personal servant. Sabina was in shock. She understood that she should not get involved with him under any circumstance. Sabina understood that in this case, she would see the prince very often. The young lady wondered if this was how the real Sabina met the prince. In the original, Mr. Simon also tried to hide the fact that Sabina was the young duchess. No matter how much power the prince had, he could not kill without consequences. The young lady wondered if it was all because she had hidden her true identity from the judge. She knew that if she confessed now, she would be killed for deceiving the prince. But she also knew that she couldn't pretend to be the maid's daughter. The prince looked at her and smiled and told her not to worry, as she would not be working for nothing. He said he would talk to her master and tell. The young lady was shocked, but she knew this couldn't be allowed to happen. She looked at him and told him to call. She understood that she was now literally talking to the prince, from whom they were trying to hide. Her Mr. Simon himself would kill her if you found out that the prince wanted to make. In the worst case, she will be under constant surveillance, and that way, they will definitely know about her session. She looked at the prince and said that it was a great honor for her to serve His Highness, so she did not need anything. Sabina bowed and said that since the lady was not in the mansion now, if he needed her help, he could contact her at any. The prince frowned and said that this was very unexpected. The young lady knew she had to pretend as long as she could, so he wouldn't suspect anything. But if he started acting strange, she would. The prince looked at her and said that he would not detain her now and take up her time. He said that he would wait for her here after his classes were over, and she was free until lunch. The prince grinned and told her not to be late to meet him. A moment later, the young lady stared intently at the departing prince. Fabian noticed that they had already finished their conversation. Fabian ran up to the prince and asked his son with a smile on his face who he had. He said that he had spoken to the young lady's personal maid. Fabian froze in surprise, not understanding which maid they were talking. The prince looked sideways at the young man and said that he had been talking to their daughter. Fabian was shocked by what the prince said. The prince looked at the young man and asked if he was not going. Fabian looked at the prince in bewilderment and timidly said that he had forgotten something in the annex. He looked at the prince and asked if he would mind if he returned to the annex for a short while and joined him a little. The prince looked at the young man with a grin and said that, of course, he didn't. Fabian looked at the prince and timidly said that he would go first. The prince looked at the departing youth with a grin and said that if they wanted to deceive him, then they should have thought it through more carefully. The prince understood that the heir would not have hung around an illegitimate girl. Sabina was frozen in shock, shaking and wondering if she was still alive. Fabian came closer to her and called. Fabian looked at his sister in surprise and asked what she was thinking when she spoke so casually to the prince. The young lady looked at her brother with fury, and she looked at him and asked why he called her to where the prince was. The young man looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand what she was talking about. He looked at his sister with a smile and said that she didn't have to thank him, since it wasn't that difficult to. The young lady was shocked. She looked at him and shouted in anger. Was he crazy? She asked why he didn't even discuss this with her. He looked at her and asked what was wrong with him, deciding to fulfill her. She was shocked and asked when this happened. She said something like that. A moment later, she remembered their recent conversation. She froze with indignation because she now understood how he perceived her words. The young lady froze with shock. She did not understand, since when he began to treat her so caringly. She sighed heavily as she understood that her brother was simply selfish, and she had no more words for their. She looked at him and said that she told the prince that she was the daughter of a maid. Fabian looked at her and said that the prince said that he came. She looked at him and said that the prince had told her to help him, since the Duchess had left. Sabina told Fabian that she would wait for him in the annex, and he should come when classes were over. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked why she had lied to him. The young man was shocked. He said that this was just nonsense, and he didn't even know that she would decide to deceive the prince. Sabina said with fury that this was an order from her. She looked at her brother and said that Mr. Simon told her to pretend to be a maid if she did meet the prince. The young man froze in place. The young lady looked at her brother and said that whatever the case, it was because of him that she had bumped into the prince, and therefore he was obliged. She understood that all this time he had been acting arrogantly and haughtily towards her, and now he. Sabina looked at her brother and said with a smile on her face that if he refused, she would tell Monsieur Simon that he had deliberately set her up with the prince as a ridiculous joke. She looked at him and asked if he was afraid of his grandfather's. Fabian looked at the young lady in surprise and said that he only wanted to help. He asked her angrily if she thought anyone. The young lady looked sideways at her brother and told him to stop stuttering and listen to her. The young man was taken aback by his sister's attitude. He looked after her and told her to think it over. Fabian said that they would be executed if they found out about this, since what they were doing was a great crime. Sabina wondered if her brother really thought that they could be executed because of the young lady bowed low and greeted the prince. Sabina looked at the prince and said that it seemed like he was not the only prince who said that, with a smile. The prince looked at Fabian with a smile and said that he did not expect the young gentleman to be such a pleasant companion. Fabian bowed low and with a polite smile said that it was a great honor for him to take care. Fabian was to blame for the danger she was now in, so if the prince decided to attack her, she would hide behind Fabian's back without a twinge. She understood that although her brother was a complete idiot, he was definitely trained in family magic, and the prince did not have a single chance against her brother. The prince looked at the young lady and said with a smile that since the young master went with him, he would like to have a small competition. The prince asked, "How about archery?" The young lady said with a smile that in that case she would prepare. Sabina hoped that he wouldn't kill her on the second day of her stay at the estate. The prince looked at the young lady and asked if he remembered correctly that her name was Vivian. The young lady looked at him in surprise and timidly said that everything was correct. He looked at her and asked who she would be rooting for. The lady was taken aback as she did not understand what kind of childish questions the prince was asking. She understood that this was a simple test of loyalty. She looked at him and said, with a smile, that of course she would root for the prince and nothing else. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she wanted to do this. The young lady looked at him and asked in surprise what he was talking about. The prince said with a smile on his face that there must be a reason why she. The young lady was puzzled. She did not understand why the prince was asking her. She understood that even if Fabian competed with Oliver, a butler who was 50 years old, the prince looked at her and asked why she didn't answer. He said that she could tell it like it was. She looked at them and said that the prince was taller and more handsome than the young master, and besides, he was basically magnificent. The prince laughed and told the young gentleman that he needed to work on regaining his popularity. Fabian said that it was not a matter of popularity. It was just that this girl knew no bounds. The prince told the young gentleman with a grin that he seemed to be offended by the young lady's choice. The prince asked him if he really thought he was unworthy of Vivian's attention. Fabian was taken aback and confused. He looked at the prince and said that everything was wrong. The prince smiled and told the young gentleman what he thought. The prince said with a grin that if he wins even once. The prince sighed heavily and said that it seemed he had missed the target again, and he was very. The prince looked at the young gentleman and said with a smile on his face that he was the best at shooting. Fabian smiled and said. She watched the young men closely. She understood that he had missed again. She saw that Ricardo was not even trying, and it was obvious. The prince looked at the young lady and said in a puzzled tone that he had such a charming lady rooting for him, but he managed to lose. The young lady looked down and said that it was just. The prince looked at her and said with a smile that he still risked tarnishing his honor and reputation. And this did not give him. The prince said that he simply had to keep something for himself as a memento. He pulled back his bowstring and looked sideways at the young lady with a smirk. Sabina looked at him with fear because she did not understand what he intended to do. She knew that he was unpredictable and could easily. The prince shot an arrow and hit a bird that was flying. The young lady was shaking with fear. Sabina was in shock as she suddenly felt fear throughout her body. She knew he had just shot a bird, but she was already shaking. The prince looked into the distance and said that the bird must have fallen somewhere nearby. The young lady looked intently at the prince and said that she would go at once. The prince said that he would like the young master to do this. Fabian, in turn, looked at the prince in surprise, as he did not expect to hear something like that. Fabian looked at the prince and asked why he should go. The prince said that the young lady was very small, and they couldn't just let her go into the forest alone. Fabian said that judging by the development of her thinking, The prince looked at him and said that he might be so, but still her body was of a real age, and he was not sure that she would be able to carry the heavy carcass of a bird. Fabian looked at him and said that he just did not know. The young lady looked at the prince and said that she would go, but the prince was categorical in his answer. The prince looked at the young man and said that this was very rude towards a child. Fabian froze in place. Fabian looked at the prince and said that was not so. A moment later he said that he would go after. Fabian left, and the young lady was left alone with the prince. She was in shock because she understood that she should not be left alone with the prince under any circumstance. She was in shock and shaking with fear. She didn't know what to do in this situation. She was confused, as she had tried very hard to avoid this. She wondered if she should run after her brother and tell him that she would help him. The prince looked at the young lady and called her. She turned around in surprise and saw the prince looking at her intently and smiling. The prince asked if she would like to rest for a while they waited for the. The prince sat down on the blanket and told the young lady that she could also sit next to him. She looked at him in surprise. A moment later she said that she dared not sit next to him and she could. Ricardo smiled and said that everything was fine. He looked at her and asked if she would really object. The young lady froze in surprise and stared at the prince. She understood that she simply. A moment later, she sat down next to him. She felt very awkward being next to the prince. She was uncomfortable and on edge. She would like to see her maid. Now the young lady understood that she should not have left her then. A moment later, the prince took the hat from the young lady. She looked at him in surprise and bewilderment. She looked at him and asked him to give her hat back. Ricardo said, with a smile that the sun was shining in his eyes. Ricardo looked at her and said with a smile that he would give her. The prince lay down on the blanket and covered his face with his hat. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise. The young lady was confused. She didn't want him to see her with her hair down, because all members of the Charlotte family have one thing in common: incredibly beautiful. They also have one feature that unites them: piercing blue eyes. She understood that there was no point in hiding her face, since the prince had already seen it. But if he found out about this, it would not be difficult for him to The young lady knew that she couldn't let this happen, not while she was in the mansion. The young lady sat down and sighed heavily as she realized that she could do nothing now. At the moment, she felt calm next to the prince. A moment later, the silence was broken, and the prince said that it smelled like pansies now. The young lady was. She sighed heavily and said that it seemed like the smell of shampoo had not. She was shocked and realized that he had an excellent charm. She remembered that, in the novel, there was a moment when Ricardo noted the pleasant smell of the main character. The prince said that he was very bored and asked the young lady to tell him something about herself while they waited. Sabina said that she had nothing to tell him, since nothing interesting had happened in her life. The prince asked her if the storyteller determined. The young lady was a little confused, as it was very difficult for her to pretend to be the daughter of the head maid. She understood that in such a case, they say that lying is a weak business. He asked her how old she was turning this year. The young lady knew it was an easy question, and she said she would be turning 12. The prince said with a smile that after so many years, she should have at least some life experience. The prince asked if it was difficult for her to serve the young lady. The young lady said that this was not so, as she did not like her, so they were not very close. The prince asked in surprise why this happened. Sabina said that the young lady did not have a very good relationship with the head. The prince asked the young lady who the young mistress was close to. Sabina was shocked because she did not understand why the prince was asking these strange questions. She had the feeling that he was trying to find out something about her. She said that there were no such people. The prince asked in surprise, "How could this be?" The young lady said that in this house no one values the young lady, and there is no one to build warm relations. The prince sighed heavily and said that he thought everyone was taking care. Sabina said she thought there was a misunderstanding. She asked if he hadn't heard the rumors. She didn't understand why he thought someone should take care of her. She said that the famous Charlotte family and the illegitimate child is a great grief for the whole family. She said that if the prince had seen for himself how Mr. Simon was tormenting the young lady, he would not have spoken like that. For a moment, the prince asked the young lady if this was some kind of manifestation of love. She was shocked and did not understand what he meant by. She said that such words hurt the lady's heart. The prince said with a grin that she could not hear them. A moment later, he put her hat on. The prince said that he thought the young lady should take a different look at her surroundings. The prince said that in the world there is such a thing as hidden motives. The young lady, without looking up, asked the prince if a family consisting entirely of pretense could be called real. The prince froze, and she knew that he was thrown out of the palace because of what happened between him and his mother. She did not understand what he could. He looked at her and said softly that it was true. A moment later, the prince walked slowly. The young lady froze in surprise. Looking at the prince, she called him. She was surprised and did not understand where he was going. A moment later, she said that the young master had not yet returned. The prince said that he did not want to see him here anymore. The prince smiled, and looking at the young lady, said that she hated her mistress's family. The young lady froze in place in surprise. Today, she realized that the prince looked more like a realistic painting than a real person. His soft smile was nothing more than professional acting. She didn't see an ounce of sincerity in it. She wondered because she was curious about what it would be like to live without ever being able to smile a truly happy smile. The young lady sighed heavily. She was glad that everything had finally ended well. She told the maid that there was no need for sweets anymore. Sabina understood that now she could go, but a moment later, entering the room, Mr. Simon asked where she had been. The young lady froze in surprise, as she did not expect to see her grandfather in the room. The young lady was taken aback. She wondered if Mr. Simon had come to her like that when he found out that she had spoken with the prince. But she answered her own question, that it was not so, because if he had found out about it, he would have. She looked at him and asked what had happened that he had decided to visit her. He looked at her and said that she had told him earlier to come to the outbuilding, and she would definitely treat him to tea. He looked at her and asked if she was really going. The young lady was stunned by her grandfather's words. Looking at him, she wondered if he really came just for this. She wondered since when they became close enough to have tea parties. She remembered the words of the prince, who told her that perhaps this was such a manifestation of. The prince told her that she should look at her surroundings from a different perspective. How in the world there is such a thing as hidden motives? Now the young lady understood that Mr. Simon had looked at her, then not with contempt, but with hidden longing. She understood that he was yearning for his once obedient eldest son, but still she wondered what the point was. She understood that even if this was true, it did not justify his actions. She still hated these people. Sabina looked at the master intently and said that he came suddenly, and her maid was not there at the moment, so she thought the preparation would take too long. She could not express her feelings. She understood that he would scold her a little for not being able to receive an important guest properly, and would leave. Mr. Simon looked at her and said that there was no need for that, and the young lady stood frozen in bewilderment, as she hadn't expected such a thing. A moment later, the young lady sat down next to Mr. Simon. He looked at her intently, but a moment later, he asked her about tea. Mr. Simon looked at his granddaughter and asked if her father had told her about making tea. The lady now realized that he was only concerned about her father, and there was no ulterior motive or manifestation. She looked at the gentleman intently and said that it was not. Mr. Simon looked away and said that he didn't think he should have asked. Mr. Simon, looking at his granddaughter, said that in fact, this is the tea that her grandmother made during her life. The young lady looked at him and said that Mrs. Dorothy often treated them to chamomile and honey tea. Mr. Simon froze in place. He looked at her and said that she just said that her father didn't tell her anything. Sabina said that was true, but her father. Mr. Simon looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand what she was talking about. The young lady said that she had read about the device in her father's diary. Mr. Simon jumped up from his chair when he heard about his sons. The gentleman looked at our granddaughter and asked where the diary was now. Had it really remained at their home? The young lady looked at her grandfather and said that they had burned him. Sabina said that after her father's funeral, they had sent him all his things. She said that there was no longer a diary in this world. She understood that this was a complete lie. Mr. Simon sighed heavily and lowered his gaze. Sabina had no intention of sharing her father's memories with his family. Mr. Simon looked at his granddaughter and asked if she remembered exactly what was there. He asked if there was anything written about him. She looked at him and said that her father never wrote anything about the family except for the tea. She looked at her grandfather and said that it was good because if the diary fell into the wrong hands, it was scary to imagine what a disgrace it would be once again. The young lady looked at the gentleman in surprise. She did not understand why he suddenly felt pain. Sabina wondered what kind of sad expression was on his face. She understood that he himself called his son the shame of the family. It was disgusting to look at him now. Sabina looked at him and said that if that was all, then he should already go back to his place, because soon it was time for the meal. Mr. Simon said that was true, and he should leave. The gentleman asked if she had already heard about the prince's arrival at the estate. The young lady froze in place at the mention of. The gentleman said that the prince would be practicing fencing every day, so she should try not to go out without a reason. But still, if she suddenly ran into him, she was obliged. The young lady looked at the gentleman and said that they would certainly do so. The gentleman said that it was not proper for her to live in the outbuilding, of course, but she needed to be patient for a little while. He said that he would send her something that Mr. Simon didn't have time to open the door when suddenly Fabian burst into the room and shouted to his sister. He didn't understand how she had the audacity to. A moment later, he saw his grandfather in front of him and was very surprised. Mr. Simon looked at us with a smile and told him to remember his status and behave. The gentleman looked at his grandson and asked what he had in his. Fabian said he caught it for his sister. Mr. Simon looked at us a lot and told us to take care that his sister would not get bored. The young lady looked at the gentleman in surprise because she realized that he thought that he and Fabian were friends. She understood that he had a very wild imagination, which had no. Fabian looked at his sister and asked what she had talked about with their grandfather. The young lady said that they had talked about little things. Fabian said that his grandfather would not have come here for no. Sabina looked at her brother in surprise and asked why he came to her. She asked if he really came to quarrel. Fabian said angrily that he wanted to give her the bird because. Fabian looked at Sabina and said that he was looking for the bird, and she, you see, secretly. Sabina looked at her brother and asked if he had said the same thing to the prince. She asked her brother if he could only be angry with her. Fabian looked at her in surprise and asked if she. Sabina looked at her brother in surprise. He looked at her and timidly said that she said that the prince was more handsome than him and that he had a better. Fabian asked his sister if she really thought. Fabian said thoughtfully that he didn't think he was the nicest person, but he certainly looked good. He also said that he has more power. The young lady was shocked. She did not understand what her brother was saying. The young lady froze, looking at the bird. She did not know what to do with it, since it was a gift from the prince. Sabina wondered if she really needed to. Fabian looked at her and said that he even shot a better bow than the prince. Fabiana said that the prince was only able to hit the bird because it was wounded and could barely move. The young lady looked closely at the bird and saw something on its leg. She understood that this bird was not wounded at all. Unfolding the note, she saw that it was not just any bird, but a homing pigeon. The Duke looked at the butler and handed him the letter and told him to send the letter to the palace. The Duke said that now in the era of the Industrial Revolution, such things are considered quite old-fashioned, but no matter how much time passes, nothing. Mr. Simon sighed heavily and said that it was a matter of magic. At that moment, the young lady learned what was special about the methods of communication with the imperial family. It turns out that their palace is full of special ancient magic, and no matter how far humanity has gone in its development, they will always have to use letters or telegrams. The young lady looked closely at the note and realized that the note was addressed to one of the members of the ruling family, but she still wondered who exactly. Based on the contents of the note, she understood that someone was reporting on what was happening in their estate, but she still wondered who it could be and who needed the fifth prince so much, who could not even claim the. She wondered if the empress who had exiled him really needed this information. The young lady was very worried about the note. Sabina wondered if she should tell the prince about this, or if she should just stay out of it. She suddenly remembered his sly grin and wily look when he said that he simply had to keep something for himself as a. The young lady was dumbfounded as she realized something. She wondered if the prince already knew about this. Sabina realized that he already knew about the surveillance, but he still gave the last carrier pigeon to her. The young lady wondered if this was a test. She wondered if he might kill her if she didn't prove she could be trusted. The young lady was confused and did not know what to do, but she still understood that she needed to remain calm and that her brother could help her. But still, something was alarming Sabina. She knew that in the original story, Ricardo had a care. Because of this whole situation, with trying to hide her, she completely forgot about it. She thought that he might not even need a sword if he suddenly wanted to kill her. She was afraid that suddenly his abilities. Sabina knew she needed to find out as much as she could about this immediately. She knew there had to be some information that would be useful to her. His hour has come, and the whole world has heard. The devil's laughter and living fire rushed from heaven to earth. The dead rose from their graves. Fertile lands fell victim to unprecedented filth. The empire plunged into its ruler, remarked de Cesario, without ceasing to pray to the Lord, went to war. He managed to imprison the great evil, in a place devoid of all light. The gods, delighted by his victory, shared their power with him and granted his people magic. Thus began a new era in the empire. The young lady was very bored while she was reading the book, but now she knew that the power of the Cesario family was of divine origin. But unfortunately, it was not explained anywhere what its essence. Even in the original story, the emphasis was on the love story. Eugenia entered the office and greeted the young lady with she came in with books and asked with a smile if there were any books among them that she had. Sabina looked closely at her teacher as she realized that she knew everything for sure. Sabina looked at the doctor with a smile and asked if she knew about the history of the empire. Eugenia looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was really interested in history. She looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if there was anything that a noble, educated lady. Sabina timidly said that the prince was staying with them for a long time. Sabina said that for this reason, she would like to delve into all the details so as not to lose face. But unfortunately in the mansion, she does not have the threat to ask for this information. Eugenia was in shock as it must have been very difficult for the young lady being all alone in the estate. She looked at the young lady and smiled and told her not to worry, as she would tell her everything now. Sabina knew that the doctor was a very sentimental person. Sabina said that they said that members of the imperial family could control. Eugenia looked at the young lady and said that it was true, and they were able to move people and objects. They can also create space and lock someone in there. Sabina asked if such a person could appear next to an enemy in an instant and swing his. Eugenia said with a smile that of course that was possible, but there was no. She said that a person could simply move the sword to the location of someone's heart or even rip it out. She said that no one else was able to kill skillfully. The young lady froze in fear. A moment later, she asked, trembling, if such a person really had no vulnerability. She sighed heavily and thought Eugenia said that if you think about it, then the Cesario family still exists today. Eugenia looked at the young lady in surprise and shock and noticed that she was shaking all over. She was shocked because she realized that she had been drinking. She looked at the young lady and said that there had been no dictators among the rulers for a long time. She told the young lady not to worry about it, and now this power is more of a symbol of the ruling dynasty than a way to maintain power. Sabina knew that she didn't understand anything because Sabina heard that Ricardo inherited this. She knew that if the doctor were in her place, she would understand why Sabina was now friends and why she was so scared. The young lady was in shock and wondered how she could avoid her death. The more she learned about Ricardo, the less she believed that she could cope with everything. The young lady wondered if she could survive this information. The doctor looked at the young lady and called her. The doctor looked at us with surprise and said that she had turned pale and also asked if she had really become ill. Sabina looked at the doctor and said that she was fine. She was just very surprised that the imperial family was so powerful. A moment later, Melissa entered the room and asked the young lady if she could speak to her. Sabina went out into the corridor and looked at the maid in surprise. She asked what happened. Melissa looked around the corridor and noticed that no one was listening to them. Melissa said she crossed paths with His Majesty a few minutes ago, and he's looking for the head maid. Melissa looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if it was really her. Sabina froze in place. She was stunned and could not come to her senses. The young lady told the maid. Melissa said that she would do everything. The young lady was surprised and wary. She wondered if the training was already over. She thought that she would most likely be able to make it in time. The prince smiled as he looked at the young lady and said that she had. The young lady bowed and greeted the prince. She looked up, stared at the prince, and was very surprised. Sabina was surprised as she noticed that the prince had come by himself and without Fabian. She wondered if he had left. The young lady looked at the prince and apologized for being. The prince said with a smile that there was nothing wrong with that, and that his classes had simply ended early, so he had. The young lady understood that he was lying, and it was all for a reason. The prince looked at her, and Ricardo said with a smile that the weather was very nice today, and they could go somewhere. The young lady was very much taken aback by such a statement. A moment later, she said she thought her mother would not allow her. She knew she could not let this. She looked at the prince and asked if they could just walk nearby. Sabina knew she had to dissuade the prince from this idea, but she didn't know. For a moment the prince thought about this, but a moment later he said that it turned out he saw a small hole nearby. The lady looked at him in surprise, still not understanding what he was talking. She was in shock, did not understand what he was talking about, since the hole could not be in the man. After some time, they came to the fence, and she saw a huge hole. The young lady was shocked, as she thought that this simply could not be, since a couple of days ago, there was no hole in the fence. She wondered if anyone knew about it. She understood that this hole could not even be called an. The prince looked sideways at the young lady and said that no one would know, so they could go. The young lady was shocked. She froze in place and wondered if the prince had actually used his. She remembered the conversation with the doctor, Sabina, then asked her if he could be there in an instant and swing the ball at the enemy. The doctor then told her that of course he could, but there was no need for it, since he could simply move the sword. The prince looked at the young lady with a smile and said that now the problem was solved and they could go. The young lady was in shock because she understood that even a wall was not an obstacle for the prince. She understood that if she refused now, he would wall her up in one of them. The young lady slowly obeyed his order. Sabina was shocked and couldn't believe it. A stranger passed by the estate and noticed a large hole. He was very surprised. The prince sighed heavily and said that there were a lot of ill-mannered people in the world now. He could not understand why they cared about someone else's house. The young lady understood that any person would be surprised to see such a large hole in the wall, but she understood that for him, this was a norm. They slowly walked around the shops and bought different goods. The prince smiled and told her to take a few more items, and then they could go back. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if he wanted to buy anything else. He looked at her and asked if something was wrong. Sabina said that everything was fine. A moment later, she went to the checkout with all the goods. She was very angry because the prince just sat. Sabina was irritated that she was now acting as a porter. They ended up just wandering around the store. Sabina knew that the prince did not stand out in any way and did not attract everyone's attention. She understood that if she wanted to survive, all she had to do was pretend to be a servant. The prince looked at the young lady and asked if she had already paid for the goods. She said with a smile that she had done. The young lady was in shock because 5 minutes ago she thought that they would not go anywhere else, but unfortunately she was wrong. She was in shock and could no longer walk with all the goods. Sabina called His Highness, but he did not hear. A moment later she called his name and he stopped. The young lady looked at the prince intently and asked him to rest for a while. The prince looked at the young lady for some time without answering. A moment later he called her stupid and said that she could have told him earlier that she needed to rest. The young lady was shocked, but wondered if he was serious now. The prince looked at her and asked what they would do if she was having a hard time. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise and bewildered. The young lady looked at the prince with a sharp gaze and asked if they could hire a carriage. Ricardo looked at her and said that of course they couldn't do that since it. Sabina looked at the prince in surprise and did not say that he had paid for all of this. She was puzzled and did not understand why he had collected so many things if he wanted to throw everything away now. The prince looked intently at the young lady, but said. The young lady sighed heavily. She was once again convinced that he was crazy. She looked at him and asked if they could go inside the cafe and rest a little. The prince said that if she wanted, she knew that psychopaths could not empathize or feel sorry for anyone. Now the young lady admired the queen, who gave birth to him and raised. But in the end, she also abandoned the prince, sending him to the Charlotte family mansion. She understood that she still could not trust him because of such a trifle. She understood that his true feelings would come out when he met the main character. But still, the young lady wondered where the main character was. The prince looked at his companion in surprise and asked what had happened. The young lady looked at him with a keen gaze, and a moment later, the young lady said with a smile that she would like to express her gratitude to him. She said that he had settled down for her sake, and now they could sit in such a public place. She was surprised, but still very. Before she thought that the prince was a time bomb, but she knew that he was still very kind to her, even though she was the daughter of an ordinary maid. Sabina looked at the prince and asked for forgiveness for disturbing him. The prince looked at her and said that the young lady thought that most likely the prince's appearance at the estate would play into her. She wondered if she could survive and if she would be on his side. The young lady looked at the prince and said that she was sure his servants were glad that he was their master. Ricardo said that. He said such people usually side with adults, not dogs. Sabina looked at the prince and said that she would like to ask him something. The young lady said she wanted to talk to her about the bird he shot yesterday. The prince looked at the young lady with a grin and said that he would certainly explain everything to her. But first, he would like. She said that nothing special was written there. They simply conveyed that the prince was welcome in the Charlotte family and that he would adapt quick. The prince sighed heavily and said that apparently they had nothing more to write about because he was not doing anything worthwhile. The young lady looked at the prince intently but said nothing. The prince looked at her in surprise and asked why she brought it up. He said he hadn't asked, but she decided to mention it anyway. He asked why she had spoken. If there was. The young lady looked at the prince intently. Now she understood everything. The real test is not the content of the note itself, but what she was supposed to do with it. She looked at him and said that he was right, and yet she felt it necessary to tell him about it. Sabina said that she was completely on his side. He looked at her in surprise, frowned, and asked, and why did she decide to take his side? The young lady was surprised, as she did not expect. A moment later, tea was brought to. The young lady thought for a moment, as she realized that she had to be careful, as her future depended on what she said now. The young lady hesitated. She did not know where to start and how to act in this situation. But still she knew that she could. Sabina said that to be honest, she had long dreamed of escaping from the mansion. The prince looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Sabina said that the mansion was especially strict with her, so she always wanted to leave. But her mother strictly forbade her to even think about it and give up. She said with tears in her eyes that only the prince had the power. The young lady understood that her maid and the doctor would not be able to get her out of the estate. Only the prince could help her, but she needed to act quickly while she was. Sabina knew that by the time he was allowed to leave the estate, she would have mastered healing. The young lady looked at the prince intently and asked him to take her with him when he left. The prince said that the world outside was dangerous. He asked if she was afraid. The young lady was confused. She didn't know what she needed to say to convince him. She looked at him intently and said that she was not afraid if he took her to the capital. Sabina said that. The prince looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really ready to follow any orders. The young lady shuddered at his tone. She looked at him and in a trembling voice said that it didn't include causing her pain. The prince looked at her with a satisfied grin and said that she didn't even have to work. Sabina looked at the prince intently. She wondered if he believed her, since he didn't answer her clearly. The prince looked at her and said that despite all her determination, he did not know whether she would be. He said that unfortunately, there were a lot of people like her in his circle. The young lady was confused. She didn't know whether she had succeeded. The prince told her that he did not know if there was a place for her. She was surprised and looked at him as she realized that he was speaking in riddles, but was still giving her. She realized that he was now hinting that she still had a chance. She realized that the words about his entourage were definitely not about the Charlotte family. She thought he seemed to be referring to his accompanying knight Reynald. As far as she knew, the prince was not alone in the mansion, and this man was his bodyguard, and it deprived him of the opportunity to make plans, because nothing can be hidden from his eyes. She thought that soon it was he who reported to the empress about what was happening in the mansion. The lady looked hard at the prince and asked if he meant sir. The prince looked at her and asked if she could lure him out of the mansion. The young lady looked at the prince intently and said that she could do it easily. Ricardo looked at her in surprise, as he didn't expect her to answer, so he looked at her and asked with a smirk if she really thought it was that. Sabina said that it would not take long, and he could rely on her. Sabina was sure that the prince did not expect such an answer, but she had many ways to fulfill. The prince looked at her and said with a smile that he couldn't wait to see her. Sabina sighed heavily, as it was physically hard for her. She was tired, as she had been running around the city with the prince all. She really wanted to go into her room and just lie down. Melissa looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she had finished her business. The young lady looked at the maid and asked if she had apologized to the doctor. Instead, Melissa looked at the young lady and said that the maid looked at the young lady and said that there had been changes in. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise, as she did not understand what she was talking about. Entering the room, the young lady was taken aback. She saw a whole mountain of gifts. She was in shock and didn't understand what was going on in her room. The man looked at the young lady and said that they were almost finished, and these were all gifts and a letter. Melissa was shocked because they transformed the room in such a short period of time. Melissa was amazed by the amount of gifts. Melissa looked at the beautiful dress in surprise and said with a smile that she had never seen such a gorgeous dress. Melissa looked at the young lady and said that since it was from Master Simon, it should. Sabina looked at the maid and said that there was no need and they could leave it. Melissa asked if there was anything important in the letter. Sabina said that she was asked to come for lunch on week. Melissa sir happily said that lately Mr. Simon has been taking great care of her, and that's wonderful. Sabina said that it's just his next whim, and there's no need to. Melissa looked at the young lady in surprise and said that she didn't think so. She said that she had talked to a girl who worked in the kitchen, and she told her about that incident with Madame Clarissa. Madame Clarissa left the mansion completely wet, disheveled, and looking like a mouse caught in a rainstorm. Melissa said that many people tried to understand who could have. Melissa looked at the young lady and asked if she thought it could have been Mr. Simon. Sabina looked at the maid and the maid said that only Mr. Simon and Mr. Benjamin could afford such a thing. The young lady looked at the maid with a grin and said that such a thing simply could. Melissa said that many people tried to understand what happened to Madame and whose fault it was, or whether she just fell due to a lunge. No one. She looked at the young lady and asked again if she thought it could be Mr. Simon. The young lady said with a smile that it sounded very funny, since his lordship could not have done such a thing in human. Sabina looked at the maid and told her to put all the gifts away in the room. Melissa obediently agreed. The young lady was confused. She didn't know what had happened between her and Madame. She didn't understand why the gentleman had sent her all these gifts. Even if he had sent them, she didn't need them. For some reason right now, she was The young lady looked at the prince and asked him to wait for her. The prince looked at her in surprise and asked if she hadn't thrown them out. Yet Sabina looked at him in surprise and asked what he was. A moment later, the prince took all the gifts from her hands and threw them in. The prince looked at the young lady and said that this was just rubbish. Sabina looked at the prince in surprise and bewildered. Now she realized that he had bought all these things not because he liked. She understood that it was all because he wanted to feel free for a little while. Those boxes and bags that now rest at the bottom of the river, and the gifts that Mr. Simon had called for. All of this was just useless trash. What they really wanted, they would never get. Sometime later, the whole family gathered for dinner. The young lady was a little puzzled, and the food did not go into her from the fire extinguishers of the atmosphere. She understood that Mr. Simon had already found. The gentleman looked at his granddaughter and said that she was not wearing the dress he gave her. She looked at him in surprise. Sabina remembered that there was a dress in that pile of gifts. She wondered if that was really what he had sent it for. 3 years ago, the maid was smiling as she was dressing the young lady and telling her that she should wear clothes that befit her status. The maid said that this dress was simply magnificent, as the head maid had ordered it especially for her. Sabina was confused. She understood that they, of course, knew better, because that's how aristocrats. Mr. Simon looked at his granddaughter with anger and asked what kind of rags these were. The young lady froze in. The gentleman looked at her and said that he had never seen her in anything expensive. He told her that she always went to his houses, which corresponded. The young lady was shocked, because from then on, no matter what she dressed, he always scolded her. Therefore, in order to avoid condemnation and bad treatment from the servants towards her, she began. Melissa looked at the young lady and asked if she wanted to go to dinner in her new dress. Sabina said that she would never wear it, and also asked Melissa if she would really go in the clothes he gave. The maid would have liked to object to her, but the young lady said that she would do something simple. Sabina found it all very interesting and funny, since he now wanted to make a doll out of. The gentleman said that besides, she wears many dresses for several days in a row, and none of them are worth even half the amount that is allocated to her for the purchase of new clothes per month. The young lady knew they had already talked about this, but she wanted to repeat it again. It's not about the money, but about the person who gives it. The young lady smiled and said that she didn't want to accidentally stain her dress. The gentleman looked at her in surprise and said that she could always buy a new dress and get. She was shocked because she pretended to be the maid's daughter. At his request, she was shocked and wondered if he would throw away a brand new dress, but she still decided to do something different. She looked at the gentleman and said with a smile that the dress was incredibly beautiful, and she would wear it carefully. The Duke looked at the young lady and told her to tell him how her days were spent. Sabina thought for a moment and said that little could happen in the annex, so she had nothing. The Duke said that he meant what she was doing, and he also asked if she was enjoying. Sabina looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected him to be interested in such things. She said that she had breakfast, read books. Sabina ran away because she realized that she had said that she was going out. She was shocked and did not understand why she had said that, because she would now be scolded for not spending time on her studies. The young lady was timid and asked for forgiveness. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked what she was apologizing for. Sabina said that she needed to pay more attention to her studies instead of wasting time on walks. She said timidly that she simply felt so free in the annex because no one could see. The Duke looked at her and said that he didn't ask her about it so that she could justify it. Now, he said that it was really important for him to know if she was comfortable in her. The young lady froze in indignation. She was in shock and did not understand what was happening. Mr. Simon looked intently at his granddaughter. Sabina looked at everyone present in surprise. She couldn't utter a word. She looked at them in surprise and wondered if they were worried about her. She knew she had suffered because of Madame not long ago, and he must have felt guilty that they had to send her to the outhouse. She thought that soon they would only. The Duke said that besides this, he wanted to talk to her about a new teacher. The Duke said that she had been studying hard for a long time, so he thought it would be okay to take a short break from her studies, but that was if she understood that she would not be able to study and meet regularly with the prince. And besides, the doctor is actively trying to hammer into her possible knowledge about. Sabina looked at the Duke and said that if he didn't mind, she would like to take a break from her lessons for a while. And she thought that having a teacher regularly coming to the annex might arouse the prince's suspicions. Fabian could not resist and asked when the prince would leave. The gentleman was shocked. He looked at his grandson and asked what kind of questions he was asking. The gentleman said that she gave him enough sense not to ask such a question of the prince. Fabian said that he would not dare to ask him such a question, but hear his own, so he could say such. The gentleman looked at Fabian and told him to be more careful and to fly off with. The gentleman told his grandson to follow his sister's example or behave decently. The young lady was surprised that she was praised even at the expense of her brother. She wondered if it was a worthy cause for pride. Fabian looked at his sister intently. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not raise his gaze. Fabian said that he had already eaten his fill. From their permission, he would leave the master. The young lady looked intently at her brother. Sabina could tell from his expression that he was hurt. She wasn't hungry, so she could easily leave her brother's father after that. The young lady looked at the men and asked if they minded if she left them too. She said she needed to talk to her brother. Fabian was shocked. He did not understand why no one noticed that the prince was lying to everyone. He said that the prince was just a cunning fox. But a moment later he heard an incomprehensible noise. Turning around, he saw his sister. The young man was shocked, as he did not expect to see. He looked at her with anger and asked who had already given her permission to enter here. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he had really scolded. The young man looked at his sister in surprise and asked. Sabina looked at him and asked with a smile if he thought they should talk. Fabian looked at his sister in surprise and asked what they should talk about. The young lady asked what he thought about the prince. The young man was taken aback. He wondered if she had noticed too. He was glad that he was not the only one who had noticed the prince's oddities. The young lady looked at her brother in surprise. As she saw that he had a suspicious grin on his face, Fabian came closer to his sister and said that she was right, and he had thoughts about the prince. Sabina was surprised, looked at him and asked what Fabian asked her angrily if she had noticed. He asked if she thought the prince was acting suspicious. The young lady sighed heavily. She understood that the prince was not so simple and had an unbalanced character. She looked at her brother and asked what was wrong with the prince. The young man hesitated because he did not know what to answer. He was very angry. Fabian was very angry, and everything was infuriating him since he had no direct evidence. Fabian said angrily that he didn't know if he should tell her, but the prince wasn't who he said he was. He was pretending to be kind for a reason. Fabian said. Sabina sighed heavily because she knew that his suspicions would soon be confirmed, and the prince would destroy their entire family. Fabian looked at his sister and said that she might not believe him, but he asked her to try to. She was surprised, looked at him, and asked if that was all he wanted to tell her. Eunice turned around. She smiled and said that she would like to ask him for something. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked why she had remained silent. Sabina looked at her brother with a keen gaze and asked if he could forge the handwriting, as if he looked at her in surprise and asked where she got this note from. She was surprised, looked at him, and asked if he was really the best in the class. She laughed and said that she knew he was faking his grades. The young man stood there in bewilderment. He came closer to her and with the speed of lightning covered her mouth with his hands and told her to be. Fabian was very scared. He asked her how she knew and if Dad and Grandpa. Sabina said that no one knows except. The young man looked at the piece of paper in surprise and asked where she got it. She sighed heavily and said that she had found it. She sighed especially heavily and said that they were geniuses and he was stupid and could not survive among them. She said that there was only one thing she did not understand, how his lie was not revealed immediately. Fabian looked at her and angrily told her not to say that, since he said that he studied hard and went to all his classes and tried hard to get good grades, but he looked away and said with sadness and longing that she had no idea how he felt. She knew that she truly had no idea how he felt because no one cared about. She knew that it was very stupid that they supported him so much, surrounded him with all kinds of attention, and all he could do was fake grades. She understood that if she were in his place, she would not do that. Fabian looked closely at the young lady. A moment later, he asked if she would tell her grandfather and father about this. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was none of her business. She showed him the note and asked if he could forge the handwriting. Sabina said that if he succeeds, she will not tell anyone and it will become their secret. The young man looked at his sister intently. A moment later, he finally agreed with. He looked at her intently and said that if her deception was revealed, then no one should know that it was he who had faked it. She understood that it could have been anyone she wanted to say so, but she remained silent. He looked at her and asked what he should write. A moment later, the young lady explained everything to him. She looked at her brother with a smirk and asked if he could do it. The young man froze in place as he was shocked by what she. The servant burst into the room and told them to see. The knight froze in place in bewilderment. He did not understand what was happening and why he had to be. He was in shock and didn't understand what they were doing. They screamed furiously at him to shut his mouth. The Duke entered the room and asked the knight if he really had the audacity to walk around his house and spy on him. The knight shouted that it was just a misunderstanding, and the Duke looked at the knight with anger and showed him the letter. He asked if the knight recognized the knight froze in place when he saw the letter in a trembling voice. He asked the Duke where he got it from. The Duke looked at the knight with a cold, intent gaze. Melissa looked at the maid in surprise and asked if the imperial knight had really been captured. Melissa was surprised and did not understand how this had happened. The maid said that she did not know everything, but they said that he was still being held in the basement and interrogated. Melissa looked at the maid in surprise and asked if the imperial knight was a spy. The maid sighed heavily and said that they needed to be careful with the gentleman since no. The maid looked at Melissa and asked if perhaps she should try to curry favor with Mr. Fabian. The maid smiled and told her to think about her words and that she needed to leave already. Melissa smiled and said that they would. Melissa, in turn, knew that it was not the young master who made and found the letter, but her young mistress herself. But no one in this mansion would know about. Melissa came into the Duke's room and called him. The Duke turned and looked at the maid. He asked what Sabina. Melissa smiled and said that the lady had asked the Duke to come by when the Duke sighed heavily and said that he would come to her in the evening. He understood that they would have a difficult and interesting Melissa left the Duke's office with a smile on her face. She smiled because she understood that the lady must be truly very important to the Duke. The Duke looked at his niece and said that she had asked to see this, and that this seal was identical to the one used by the imperial family, and it was definitely Sir Reynolds' handwriting. The Duke said that they must have wanted to. The young lady was pleased that her deception had been successful. She wanted to admit that her brother had done well after. The Duke looked at the young lady and said that the knight claimed that he wrote only about the prince's condition, but his testimony did not match reality. The young lady sighed heavily, as she sincerely felt sorry for the knight. The last thing she wanted was for the imperial knight to be tortured, but she knew she needed him to return to the palace. She looked at the Duke and asked if he had any idea why Her Majesty had sent a spy to their estate. Sabina asked if she really wanted to put the Charlotte family on a The Duke looked at the young lady in shock and asked what she was talking about. The young lady, looking at the Duke, said that the struggle for the throne between the princes was. She said that Her Majesty would definitely need the power and influence of the Charlotte family to strengthen. Sabina said that the previous empress was working for the first prince's reputation, and she was sure that she and Her Majesty would not be able to come to an agreement. The Duke was taken aback by the young lady's statement. He had not expected to hear such a thing from her. He understood that she was only 11 years old, but she already thought like The young lady came to the Duke late in the evening and asked forgiveness for the late visit. She said that she brought him a very important thing. Sabina said that a few days ago, Fabian shot a bird and gave it to her. The Duke read the contents of the letter in astonishment. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and said that it would not work to blackmail them with such a The young lady thought for a moment. She said that the second part of the letter contained data from the Vasilian family. She said that they were using the Charlotte family name for the begging match, and if word got out, it would be. She said both sides would be in an unenviable position. The Duke thought for a moment and said that if he secretly sent the knight to the Empress, that would solve everything. The young lady looked at the Duke with a smile and said that it was up to him to decide whether to turn a blind eye to this or not, since he was the one representing the interest. The Duke looked at the young lady in shock. He was stunned because he did not expect to hear something like that from her. Looking at her, he thought about how she never ceased to amaze him. The young lady looked at the Duke and said that if she were in his place, she would probably turn a blind eye to what happened. But this time the Duke looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really suggesting to hide the truth. She said with a smile that there was no need to publicly speak out against the Empress, and they could simply forgive her. The Duke looked at the young lady and said that he agreed with her. Sabina looked at the Duke and said that this was all temporary. Sabina said that the next time she needed them, she would not get their help. She looked at the Duke and asked if that sounded. The Duke looked at his niece with a smile. He smiled and said that he had no idea that she would grow up to be such a good politician. The young lady smiled and said that. The Duke smiled and said that this was not so, since she had done better than. Since he simply gave her the bird and didn't even notice the note. Sabina understood that the fact that she was better than Fabian was an obvious fact, not a compliment. The Duke looked at her and said that now he was in her debt, and if there was. The young lady came closer to the Duke and said that she had found the knight's second letter about tax evasion. The Duke looked at her in surprise. The Duke said that he was already familiar with its contents, so he had no need for it. The Duke said that he didn't care what she did with it. The Duke asked her what she thought should be done with their prince. The young lady thought for a moment. She said that she did not think that His Highness was involved, and she believed that he must not have known about the letters. Sabina said that if the Duke did notice something suspicious in his behavior, then The Duke looked at his niece and said with a smile that it sounded reasonable, and thanked her for her advice. The young lady bowed and said goodbye to the Duke. She understood that all she had to do was wait for the prince to leave the mansion, and she could leave with him. The young lady thought about the prince and wondered if the psychopath prince was happy now. The prince, in turn, sat looking out the window and thought about what was happening. He was very pleased with the master slapped his son on the cheek, shouting that he was very stupid and young. Master Simon was furious. He looked at his son and asked if he had any idea how many people would suffer because of his will. The master shouted to his son that this girl had clouded his mind, so he could not see anyone except her. The master shouted and asked if he should really remind his son of his duties. The young man shouted to his father that he loved her. Mr. Simon looked at his son and asked if he really thought that this love would last long. The young man still looked at his father with a smile and did not answer him. Simon looked at his son with fury. He couldn't understand. Mr. Simon shouted to his son that he would regret his choice. Mr. Simon was furious. He shouted reproachfully that he swears that his son will regret it. But his son came closer to him and with a smile told his father that he will never regret it, since he is sure. Mr. Simon woke up from a terrible nightmare. He was breathing heavily, and yet he knew it was just a dream. The Duke entered his father's office and called him. The Duke looked at his father and asked if they could talk, if he was not busy. Monsieur Simon said that of course they could talk, and also asked his son. The Duke said he had been there, and the room looked fine inside. The Duke said he had given it away. If something was wrong, she was happy with it. Although he thought she was offended when she found out, Mr. Simon said that he knew this since he himself had ordered that she be placed in the oldest. The gentleman said that she must have agreed to live there because it reminded her of. Mr. Simon said that now she would have to get used to the status of Charlotte. The Duke froze in place and looked intently at his father. Mr. Simon sighed heavily and said that she was very similar to her father. For a moment the Duke thought, and Mr. Simon in turn remembered their. Mr. Simon remembered how a young lady came to him and said that her name was Sabina. The gentleman looked at the young lady in bewilderment. He asked angrily why she had come, as he had told her that he did not want to see her. The maid asked the master for forgiveness. She said that they had come simply. The master shouted angrily for the maid to be silent. The master shouted that he did not want to hear or know anything about this girl, since he would never acknowledge the maid. The gentleman could not accept the young lady, so he continued to avoid her. As soon as he looked at her, he immediately remembered his son, whom he had greatly offended. After his departure, he continued to be tormented by severe nightmares. In some, he was unable to hold him back and watched as his son simply disappeared behind the door. In others, he watched himself from the outside as he begged for forgiveness on his knees, which he never did. But everything always ended the same way. The master looked at the maid and asked how the girl was doing. Vanessa sighed heavily and said she wished she had put it more. Vanessa said that the change of scenery had apparently had a strong effect on her. She became greedy, constantly buying new dresses and humiliating those below her. The gentleman looked at the maid in surprise and asked what she meant. When the gentleman had not yet recovered from the death of his son, he heard that his granddaughter had suddenly fallen in love with luxury and was. The gentleman looked at our granddaughter and said that she was dressed improperly again. He asked what happened and if he could personally look at her. The young lady hesitated and asked for forgiveness. She was very frightened of the. She lowered her gaze without looking at the gentleman and said that she would change right away. The gentleman looked at his granddaughter in shock. He was surprised and wondered if he had really been able to convince her with his words. He understood that despite this whole situation, she was his granddaughter. He understood that his blood flowed through her, so she should experience the harshness of this world. He wanted her to receive the best education, and then no one would dare to hint about her incorrect or. The gentleman was shocked and understood that his son had run away from their family and died, but she would become an ideal, as befits the children. Mr. Simon looked at his son and asked if he really wanted to introduce a teacher to the young lady. The Duke said that was exactly what he was looking for. He was looking for a suitable person for her. Mr. Simon said he heard that Madame Clarissa was now in distress. He looked at us and asked what. The Duke looked at his father in surprise and bewilderment. He asked if Madame was not his elder brother's former fiancée. Mr. Simon said that this was The gentleman said that Madame had practically become a member of their family and had proven that she was worthy of the ideal option for this position. The gentleman said that it would be good for her to come out and that she had had enough of her. The gentleman said that with her husband, they would be able to re-establish relations with her. Looking at his granddaughter, the gentleman realized that he was right. He saw how his granddaughter changed very much after Madame's arrival. He understood that all these changes were only due to the fruitful efforts of Madame Clarice. The gentleman understood that he would not repeat his mistake. Mr. Simon looked at the Duke in surprise and asked what. The Duke looked at his father and said that the Armada Clarissa had intentionally burned. The weak point. Lord Simon froze in surprise. He was shocked by what. The gentleman was furious and shouted at the servants to bring Madame Clarissa to him. Madame Clarissa looked at Monsieur Simon in surprise and asked what he was doing. She said that however it didn't matter, and she would go as she needed to. He looked at her with fury and used his power on her. The lady fell to the ground with a crash. She looked at the gentleman in surprise and asked what he was doing. Mr. Simon looked at her furiously and shouted at her to Mr. Simon came closer to her with anger and asked how she dared to harm his granddaughter. He was angry and could not contain his emotions. He looked at her with fury and shouted that she should have only been engaged in her training. Madame looked angrily at A moment later, she asked furiously if that wasn't what he wanted. The gentleman was taken aback and looked at her with surprise and shock. Madame called out and asked if he had not called her so that she could show her where her place was. Madame said angrily that if this was not so, then he should not have invited her to this house at all. Mr. Simon looked at her in surprise and bewilderment and asked what she was even talking about. He came closer to her and said that he just wanted the relationship between their families to improve. Madame looked at him with tears in her eyes and said that she should have become. The gentleman was shocked. He froze in bewilderment when he saw that Madame burst out laughing. He froze because he did not understand her reaction. He did not understand why she was behaving like this. The lady looked at the gentleman with tears in her eyes and said that he was still as cruel as he had. The gentleman was in shock. He did not understand how he could have made the same mistake again. Now he realized that everything had repeated itself, just like with Mr. Simon sighed heavily and said that he did not want to repeat the same mistakes again. But now he doesn't understand why things are even worse now than they were then. The Duke sighed heavily and told his father that his brother was dead. The Duke said that they could not return anything. They just had to move. Mr. Simon sighed heavily and said that he knew he would never do such a thing. The Duke said that his brother was strong and smart. The Duke understood that in fact, his brother seemed to want to teach them a lesson, built a wall between them, but now his daughter lives next to them, where he himself did not want to live. The Duke said that the young lady was able to so cleverly turn the situation to her advantage. Sometimes it seems to him that she is much older than. The Duke said that sometimes he even thought that she was better than his brother, on whom his father had placed great hopes. Monsieur Simon looked at his son and asked if he really wanted. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he was simply afraid that if they made the same mistake, Mr. Simon thought for a moment. Mr. Simon walked silently through the office. When he sat down on the chair, he sighed heavily and said that every day he was getting more and more tired of this. The prince looked at the young lady and smiled and told her to hurry. The young lady looked at the table with surprise, where there were various desserts, and said that this was very unexpected. The prince said that it was all for her, as the empress had summoned Sir Reynald to the imperial palace. The prince sighed heavily and said with a smile that he felt free, now that no one was bothering him. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as Milady was a little puzzled. She didn't want anyone to know about this meeting. The prince poured her tea and pulled the cup closer to her. She thanked. The young lady smiled and wondered if the servants seriously considered the prince a despot. She said with a smile that she would dine alone with the prince, and this embarrassed her. He looked at her and smiled and told her not to worry, as he didn't like sweets. He said that she seemed to like the desserts, since during their walk together, she kept looking back and looking at the different desserts. Sabina was surprised. She did not understand. The young lady looked away and said that she had simply never eaten anything like it before. The prince, in turn, he looked at the young lady intently, as he could not understand why this had. He sighed heavily and asked if her lady was really so greedy that she wouldn't share desserts with her friend. Sabina sighed heavily and said that the lady simply couldn't afford such a thing. You looked at her and asked if Charlotte's family couldn't afford any of the desserts. He said that she knew it sounded very funny, but she still knew that no one treated her like a lady. And even the chef never asked about her food prep. And she saw such a richly decorated table only at the celebration in honor of the young gentleman's birthday, because Mr. Simon didn't want to show it to anyone. She had to look at everything from afar. Cake at her birthday party, and the dinner was no different from a regular meal. The more she thought about it, the more she now realized that she had not lived like a lady. Sabina looked at the prince and said that she was not joking. He looked intently at the young lady, but did not. A moment later, looking at the weakness, he said that everyone thought she lived in luxury, but Sabina looked at the prince in surprise and asked what he was thinking about. The prince said that he was thinking about why they were treating the lady like. Sabina sighed heavily and said that he should ask the Duke or Monsieur Simon about that. She understood that she needed to change the subject and asked him if he was satisfied with the work she. The prince said with a smile that she had exceeded all his expectations. He looked at her and said with a grin that as he had promised her, he would. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise and thanked him. She knew that she had won, and the prince would take her away, and then she would leave. The young lady understood that the story of the real Sabina. The prince sighed heavily and looked at the young lady. He said that it seemed that she felt sorry for Sir Reynald. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand why he suddenly started talking about this. She looked at him and said that it was not. Sabina said that she would not dare to go against the prince's orders. The prince said with a smile that it seemed that she was not as heartless as she tried to appear. Sabina looked at him and asked if she hadn't done what he wanted. Sir Reynald cared about the prince. The prince looked intently at the young lady, but did not answer, and she looked at him in surprise. He sighed heavily and said with a smile that of course he was the villain here. The prince smiled and said that she could have dessert, and he called her. The young lady slowly enjoyed the delicious dessert. The delicate cream perfectly complemented the taste of the tea. The prince looked at her and said with a smile that she ate very appetizing. She noticed his intense gaze on her. Sabina was very surprised and did not feel very comfortable. She wondered if she had eaten too much. She thought that she had to offer the prince something to eat. She saw a beautiful strawberry cake. It looked big and delicious. She pushed a piece of cake towards him and told him to take it. And the prince looked at the cake in surprise. Sabina was surprised because even psychopaths have a sweet taste. She wondered why this made her. She didn't want to say anything and interrupt this beautiful picture. The prince sighed heavily and said that the cake was too sweet. She looked at him in surprise as she understood that the cake could. She looked at him and said with a smile that they say there is fighting going on in the south now, so they never even dreamed of such sweets. But unlike them, their tea here is simply. She understood that she would be thrown out there if she made a mistake in even one thing. The prince looked at her in surprise. Without a moment later, he asked her why she rejoiced at someone else's misfortune. He said it was not nice. He asked if she thought the same. The young lady was taken aback by his words. She raised her eyebrows, looking at him that he was too smart to be a. The prince looked at her and with a smile told her to eat and not talk nonsense. Sitting by the window, the prince thought about today's situation. He didn't understand what kind of abnormal and strange family the young lady. He wondered why a noble lady could not afford such sweets. He knew they were just pretending not to care about her, hiding their care and concern behind cold masks. He knew they were. He remembered how the young lady had told him that if he took her to the capital, she would carry out any order. He liked the way she spoke directly and clearly when she wanted some. He thought that she was very smart and would try to please him. and that it was reasonable on her part. He looked at the cake with a smile and remembered the young lady. He thought that he was even ready to close his eyes to the fact that she was deceiving him and pretending to. After all, she did carry out his order. He assumed that she was very loyal and would make a good. The prince thought for a moment, but suddenly he heard a knock at the door. Opening the door, he saw a man, basically surprised, asked what happened. The servant greeted His Highness. The servant said that Mr. Simon was asking him to pay attention. The prince said with a smile that it seemed they needed advice about his accompany. The servant looked at the prince and said that Master Simon was waiting for him. The gentleman greeted His Highness. Mr. Simon looked at the prince and told him to. The prince looked at his master with a smile on his face. Mr. Simon looked at the prince and said that he hoped he liked the mansion. The gentleman asked the prince if. The prince smiled and said that he did not want to cause him any more trouble, as they thought he was not. The prince looked at the gentleman with a smile and asked what he wanted to talk. The gentleman said he would like to discuss what had happened with Sir Reynald. The prince looked at the gentleman and said with a smile that he was showing such concern towards the exiled prince. The prince smiled and asked the Lord to allow him to repay such kindness. He said that he would grant the Charlotte family the right to decide the fate of his accompany. The gentleman looked at the prince with a surprised look and thanked him for his understanding. The prince said that however his mother was still too reckless, the prince understood that the deed was already done, and it was time to distance the Charlotte family. The prince said that by doing this to people to whom she herself had left her son, he wanted to lower each other in their eyes and gain the trust. The prince said with a grin that who would have thought that this sweet woman would do. The prince looked at the gentleman with a grin, since apparently he had done a pretty good job of impersonating. The gentleman said that Her Majesty assured her that she had no knowledge of it, and the gentleman said that he thought she was anxious about the prince. The prince looked at his master in surprise. The prince said that it sounded very beautiful. The prince said that he would never believe this lie. He looked at Mr. Simon and said that people rarely notice when their loved ones change. Mr. Simon froze in place at his word. The prince said that it was only at the moment when someone else's blade passed through their body that they understood. The prince said that at that moment they were shouting how stupid they were. The prince sighed heavily and said that he was speaking from. Mr. Simon fell silent and did not utter a word. The prince stared at the beautiful painting that was in the office. He looked at the picture with a grin and said that it was very interesting that they had a very close-knit family. Looking at the painting, he said with a grin that he did not see a young lady in it. Mr. Simon was taken aback by his words and said in a trembling voice that the thing was that she had only recently become part of their. The prince looked at the gentleman with a grin, as he found it very amusing how the gentleman reacted when talking about. The prince said that since she was from the Charlotte family, she must be a beautiful lady. He said that he was very sorry that they were never able to. The prince said that it was very surprising and mysterious. The prince looked at Mr. Simon and asked if he simply did not want to show her because he was afraid that the prince might get close to her. Mr. Simon froze. A moment later, he said that his granddaughter was not yet ready to meet His Highness. The prince looked at the gentleman with a grin and asked if he was really so sure. The prince gazed intently at the beautiful painting. A moment later, the prince said with a smirk on his face that he thought the crown would suit her perfect. Mr. Charlotte was shocked by the prince's statement. The prince looked at the lord with a grin and said that he was only joking. The prince said that he believed that they had settled all the issues and asked the lord to provide him with the knights of the family as an. The prince said he needed someone who would not interfere in his affairs as he. The gentleman looked intently at the departing prince and agreed with. The master was furious at such words of the young prince. The gentleman was in shock. I did not understand how this offspring could be the son of their beautiful. The gentleman understood that in addition to the incident when the prince wounded her, something else had definitely. He understood that the empress had sent him to them, not because he was disobedient, but for something else. He understood that it was not difficult to figure out the information, but Her Majesty's refusal of the prince was not the. The gentleman felt that they were being drawn into something very dangerous. For a moment the young prince even felt sorry for Mr. Simon. The prince remembered the young lady I had asked for help in leaving the mansion. The prince knew that the gentleman had no idea what his granddaughter really wanted. He remembered how the gentleman said that he loved his granddaughter very much, but it was not visible. He remembered how his mother, with tears in her eyes, said that she did everything for him. He understood that she did it in vain. Only with the young lady did he feel at ease and relaxed. He understood that he should be in his. The prince realized that he needed to return her there soon. He had already turned around and was about to go into the room when suddenly he saw the empress. The young lady sighed heavily. She looked at her brother, who was sitting next to her. Sabina called him. Sabina shouted loudly for him to be serious, and the young man was taken aback. He looked at her and asked in a trembling voice how she could be so calm. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he was talking about this again. She said that they wouldn't be caught if they suspected anything. They would just pretend that they didn't know anything. Sabina asked him not to get work. The young man was very scared. He looked at his sister and asked what she was talking about. Sabina said that if it was destined to happen, then it would happen, and that would be the end of them. He walked up to her and said that he was stupid to trust her. A moment later he noticed that she was about to go somewhere. He looked at her in surprise, and Sabina looked at him and asked him to be quiet for a bit, or she would go right now and tell who actually forged the letter. The young man froze in place. He shouted that she was lying and would not dare to do this. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she hoped that he believed her. He was shocked and asked if she had said that on purpose. He asked how she dared to mock them. He shouted at her not to remain silent. She looked at him sideways and said that if he was scared, he could just sit and wait, and if something happened, she would take full responsibility. The young man hesitated, not knowing what to answer. Sabina looked at her brother with a keen gaze. She noticed that he was just walking down the corridor. She thought about how her brother was very cowardly, and it seemed to her that all members of this family tended to remain silent at the right. The young lady was wondering if Ricardo had returned. She didn't think their conversation would last so long. She knocked, but no one answered her. She understood that if she waited for him here, she would be recognized. She understood that she couldn't stay here, and they needed to quickly leave a note. Entering the room, she saw a sheet of paper on the table. She was surprised because there was a piece of paper and a pen on the table, and she wondered if he knew she would enter the room. She understood that if she was noticed in his chambers, they might misunderstand something. She wanted to quickly write a note and leave, but suddenly she heard someone leave and hid. She barely managed to hide. The Empress looked at her son and said that he seemed to like being in the Charlotte family. She said that he had changed a lot and looked fresher. Sabina was surprised. The Empress looked at her son and asked if this was the reason he had betrayed. Ricardo looked at his mother and said that he didn't understand what she was talking about. The Empress said she had not asked Sir Reynald to report to her on all the affairs of the Charlotte family. The Empress looked at the nose, and she told her that Sir Reynald was loyal to the empire and the ruling dynasty. He could not betray them. Ricardo looked at his mother and said that she believed she was mistaken. His loyalty to her turned out to be a lie. The Empress screamed in her rage and called the prince. She asked if he was involved. He looked at the Empress and with a feigned grin said that he did not understand what she was talking about, and it was not him at all. The Empress looked at her son in shock and asked in a trembling voice what he had planned. She said that it was a great shame, and no one believed her when she told everyone that she was not involved. She asked him furiously if he realized that she had almost lost the trust of her loyal allies. Of course, they said they believed her, but she saw doubt in their eyes, and all because she had no hard evidence. The Empress shouted that she knew he was involved in this, but she did not say so in order to protect him. She asked her son if he thought she deserved at least. She said that she was no longer asking him for anything and asked him to be patient until this whole inheritance situation was resolved. She asked him to stop creating problems. The Empress, without looking at her son, asked if he could do this for the sake of Remedios, his mother's. Ricardo looked at his mother in surprise and said with a smile that if he thought about it, he also had the right to become emperor, but that was. She looked at her son and said he didn't deserve this. The Empress said she said that he should not control people and their lives. She said that even if all the heirs disappeared in an instant, he would still never become an emperor. She sighed heavily and told him to be reasonable and listen to him. The empress said that when he grows up, he will do whatever he wants, because then he will no longer be her. The young lady was shocked by what she just heard. She did not utter a sentence. Ricardo asked his mother with a grin if she was really saying that she was defending him now. He said that it was just utter nonsense. He came closer to her and told her to let go of the pretense already. He told her to admit already that the bastard standing in front of her had just emerged from. The prince said that the illustrious empress had decided to kill her useless son, and after an unsuccessful attempt, had exiled him to the Charlotte. He looked at her and said that even her husband doesn't know why she actually abandoned her child. Sabina was in shock. She was shaking under the table. Sabina wondered if they had left. Ricardo had been tried to be killed. She also wondered if she had the right to know. The empress looked at her son with horror. She screamed angrily and asked why she hadn't given him. The empress looked at her son and saw horror. She walked away, stunned, and asked why he was looking. The empress looked at her son and asked if he really wanted to strangle her like last. Ricardo looked at his mother and said that it was so and he wanted to do it. He looked at her and told. Ricardo looked at his mother and told her to run and continue hiding her true self. He told her to run away because she herself made him like this. He looked at her with fury and told her to be afraid of. A moment later, he opened the door for her, and she ran out of the room. The prince walked near the door in silence for some time. The young lady was in shock. She didn't know how long she would have to hide here. She heard him coming towards her, and Sabina was shaking very badly. She mentally asked him not to come. A moment later, he walked over and looked intently at the young lady who was looking at him dumbfounded. Ricardo called the young lady. She pulled away and said that she shouldn't have eavesdropped, and the prince looked at her and asked with a grin why she was shaking. Ricardo, unexpectedly for the young lady, the prince hugged her. She was surprised, wondering what was going on. Ricardo asked if she had heard it. He asked if the young lady had heard that his mother had wanted to kill him first. Sabina was shaking with fear. Ricardo said that she should remember this, and only this. Ricardo said that she had said earlier that she would always be on. She asked if it was true. He said it was, and asked if she would follow all his orders. He said she didn't need to be afraid of him. Ricardo said that he doesn't have many comrades, so he values. Sabina was shocked by what she heard, because as everyone had said before, it was the prince who wanted to kill his mother, but it turned out that it was the empress who attacked him. Eugenia called Sabina, and she woke up from her. She looked at the young lady and asked if she was okay. Sabina said she was okay. She was just thinking for a moment. She asked the young lady. Sabina smiled and said that she had done everything. Eugenia reviewed her homework and asked the lady if she really wanted to go to the. The young lady sighed heavily and asked the doctor if she really shouldn't. Eugenia Pierre looked at the young lady and said nothing. Eugenia said with a smile to the young lady that judging by everything, she definitely wouldn't be able to concentrate on the lesson today. She asked if Sabina wanted to try something. Sabina looked at the object in front of her in surprise and asked what it was. Eugenia smiled and said it was a magic. She said that they absolutely must know about her abilities. She said that she wanted to know how strong the young lady was. Eugenia looked at the young lady and asked if she wasn't interested. Sabina understood that she cared about her very much, and she had to please her. She smiled and said that, but a moment later, they saw that she had no abilities. The young ladies both looked at the object in bewilderment. Eugenia was shocked. She said that this was simply impossible, and it seemed that the analyzer simply broke. The young lady thought about it and asked if it could be that he simply couldn't withstand the full force of her power. Eugenia looked at the lady in surprise and asked if that was really why he showed zero. She said that even if Sabina wasn't as strong as she would like, it was still. The young lady looked at the doctor with confusion as she realized that he was speaking to himself. Eugenia looked at the device with a smile on her face, so she understood. Eugenia told the young lady that she had seen something in the book and that she needed to wait because she would find everything. Now Sabina looked at the doctor with her bewilderment. Eugenia looked at the young lady and said that it was just a sacred power. Sabina looked at her in surprise and asked what it meant. Eugenia said that all this time, the manna flowed exclusively through her body and could not manifest. Sabina sighed heavily and said that she did not believe in God, let alone sacred power. Doctora said that it was not about her faith. Eugenia said that it is God's choice, that the power manifests itself when it is given a new name. The cessation of sacred magic works much easier than its other form, because God is all-powerful, and He can. The young lady thought that she just needed to pray. Not study, but just pray. She realized that she needed to receive a second name at baptism. She looked at the young lady and said with a smile that, to put it simply, Sabina was able to heal literally everything. Sabina looked at the doctor in surprise. Eugenia hesitated and said that she could heal everything except mental disorders. The young lady was shocked as she realized that she would not be able to help the prince. Sabina said with a smile that it meant that Fabian would have to live like this for the rest of his life. She said that she felt very sorry for him. Eugenia laughed, and a moment later said that it wasn't that important now, but she still wanted to know if Sabina was